I'm hoping we can do a lot of stuff today, and we have a lot of opportunities to explore a whole bunch of different things. And as I said yesterday, the ultimate goal, let's do something that's really useful. Right? And so we're completely flexible. The possible itineraries for today is that if there are things that we didn't talk about yesterday that seem to be like, well, that's of real interest, we could pick them up, this morning for an hour or something, and just kind of go through and highlight what's going on. I'd like then to switch over to hear from you what problems you're working on, and just for us to get some idea about, here's the Adelaide group, these are the kind of things that they're working on, these are the kind of issues that are important to them from the point of view of geophysics. We were talking last night just about important aspects of especially EM, and that's data quality and standards, and making sure that you actually have all of the information that you need in order to forward model. Basically, you have all the information that you need to forward model so that you really understand the system's parameters. Then you're good to go. I'm sure everybody here, and certainly for us, sometimes we get data sets, and we spend 90% of the time just trying to figure out what the hell the data are, what normalizations are, and then there still might be some filterings that are obscure, and you scratch your head, and then you finally phone the contractor, and he either says one of two things. He says, oh, I have no idea what's going on, which is often the case. Or the second is, oh, but there's filter parameters. Didn't you know about those, right? And it's a waste of time. It drives us crazy. And as we were talking at dinner last night, maybe forums like this are ways to kind of move ahead a little bit on trying to standardize things, or at least maybe some of the things that we do could actually be a bit of a portal whereby people could put on pieces of software or things that might be useful for doing some processing, or might be useful for just making sure that the quality of data is right, or even if you've worked with data from a particular processor that at least captures, here's the essential information that you need in order to forward model it. Here is time t equals 0 for this system. Here's what they mean when they say a ramp is turning off by whatever. I mean, those are kind of practical issues, but they're actually really important, and we could do some of those or talk about that at least. The other things that we have that we'd very much like to share with you. Lindsay opened up SIMPEG yesterday, kind of talking a little bit about kind of generally what it is. We could look through, have more of a tutorial on how the SIMPEG framework works, so that you might try to use it for your own forward modeling or inversion. How many people here program or have programmed in Python? About half. That's good. Anyway, that could be opened up to kind of show what is going on there. And then the other thing are tutorials. We've got tutorials on forward modeling and inversion. We've got a very nice one on using magnetotellurics, just the 1D. That's kind of nice because it has all of the elements that would be involved in any inversion and forward modeling, and it can kind of take you all the way through from like, okay, so here's Maxwell's equations. Here's how I could discretize them. Here I got my matrix on what to solve. So all those things are possible. Got a day. So let's do something that makes it really useful. So with that, I guess I'll throw it open. Let's do the first thing first. First of all, is there material from yesterday, some of the case histories, or some of the tutorial information that we had, let's say on EM coupling, or extracting IP from data, or control source, read environments, or yeah, whole bunch of stuff. Is there anything there that people would be particularly passionate about?
Doug, do you have anything on airline IP? Like, or no?
Yeah.
So, inductive source IP as opposed to.
Yeah.
Something about that.
Do we give that for free or do we charge? I can't remember.
That's the going rate.
Okay, that's one thing. Yeah, I've got actually. I was asked to give an opening talk at a symposium in India, and there presented a bit of background about IP, which we kind of did yesterday, and then went through it for a grounded system, and then we went also through it for an inductive system.
Yeah.
And then the example that we have that comes out of that is for the kimberlite deposit at GeoSci.xyz, and that's what I made the
Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about the difference of you explore the difference between the Pelton and the Coco and stuff like that, or is that maybe?
No, I don't really have much to say. Those are, I mean, the Coco models, I mean, you saw yesterday that what's going on really at the IP level. This is a microscopic phenomenon, right? And then there's questions about how to capture the how to capture that in a macroscopic way. The Coco is, I think, a very good way of doing it. Stretched exponential as one fewer parameter, and we've been using that a little bit, and that's good. I think the main thing is to kind of know what you're have the equations with that intrinsic chargeability kind of built in. You know, you could do your forward modeling, and then you could see, you know, for what range of times that you're interested, you know, what's an appropriate parametric representation of this. It's just a proxy to things. Don't get too carried away by, oh, the value of C is 0.27. That means, you know, the rock is this, or that's a bit micro-tuning. It's a way of kind of capturing what's going on with just a couple of parameters when you've got a really complex process. So we tend to use Coco, but we'll often just do the Debye model, right? Say, you know, C equal 1.
Sure. Yeah, no, I guess that's one of the things, I guess, when we had that conversation with the mineral exploration side of things here, because they're thinking of massive sulfides and things like that, not like using a bird discrimination tool. Just sort of how to go about it. Are we fixing a C, and then, or are we actually going to play with that to try and resolve that a bit more, and things around the frequency at which we're transmitting, how resolvable are really things? Are we, you know, it's just different issues because of the base frequency we're transmitting on the airborne, sort of limited to what is really resolvable or not on the IP side of things, right?
So I think this is probably worth a discussion when we talk to people who are interested in IP. Some similar questions often come up, and I'm usually as ambiguous as just talked about now. But perhaps we could go through this example for GeoSci.xyz, and then, because what comes out of there is there's at least a couple of rocks that are very distinctive, you know, and there might actually be a way of seeing all 4 rocks from the IP. We can look at the plot and you can see if things look a bit clustered to you or not. Yeah, and then maybe use that as a basis for discussion. Let's see, so that all charged up. Is it in there? Pardon me?
I'm just having. Oh, it's in EM code. No, it's right. It's
All charts up Australia. There we go. Okay, so this is work that maybe we could kill. Actually, if somebody knows how to kill the lights, I'll find my flipper here. Sure. I'll put this guy on. Okay, so this is this work that we did with Sagi Kang. Sagi is also finishing up his PhD. It's actually been his work as Lindsay's work that have been really major contributors to a lot of the material that you're seeing. Lindsay's definitely responsible for the beautification of all of these slides as well as some of the numbers. And Sagi's done a lot of the programming for all of this. And so we saw this yesterday. There's our motivation. Our motivation for IT, we did yesterday sort of this phenomenological idea, just a cartoon. I still think that helps a lot, helps me a lot, just kind of grounds me. And helps me understand why there's this overvoltage and anything there is the decay. And different.
Dave, on that slide, you've got hematite is 0. Then there's been some work here at Prominent Hill, and they found that hematite was chargeable. Got any feelings about that?
No, but that's an interesting
and
comment.
There was also some work in Western Australia on hematite there, and they came to the conclusion that it was chargeable too.
Oh. Any kind of significant or just like barely?
Significant, I think. John Hart, I think it's
John
Hart at
Where's the real now?
no, yes,
Oh.
it was with Minute.
Oh,
So they did
okay.
drill hole work, I think. So it's with borehole.
Yeah. Oh, that would be interesting. So he's with Rio.
Is with Rio now.
Oh, okay. Well, we can talk to.
Because presumably it's a different mechanism for whatever reason. It's, well, how porous is hematite? Certainly,
Hematite comes in lots of different geometries, so potentially a plating hematite has some chargeable properties as opposed to the purity of the structure of the
so it's not the hematite itself, but something associated.
I think so. Cookies, Charles, I'll ask Charles.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
He's sort of
No, he's did the paper, I did a Google search. But there's definitely work in Western Australia as well.
Well, the other thing I was just thinking about, so these numbers are pretty dated, and they come from the Newmont standard of looking at whatever to whatever. I'm not sure what that time window is. But maybe, pardon me?
There's always a fight over that one, whether it's 450 to 50 or 550 to.
There's many nuance standards.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Well, it's roughly, from half a, from 500 through to 1500 roughly.
Okay.
But we use the John Payne nuance standard. So,
Ooh. Yeah, I've heard that's really at the top of the heap.
It's a bit tough.
I think you're in good shape.
It's safe.
But it might also be that, it's chargeable, but it's very fast. So you don't see it on these kinds of things. Yeah, we showed that yesterday. We talked about all this. And the fact that it's a two-stage process. You need to have the connectivity, then use that connectivity for the sensitivity. So I showed these examples yesterday. Then we did the IP inversion. It's fine. And the challenge now on this next set is EM coupling, because when we turn this off, okay, so the IP would tend to just decay down like that. But once you turn this off, now you've got all these EM induction effects, and you actually have this negative that's coming in. So that is clearly going to mess around with what you're trying to find here. So the goal is to realize that there's two things going on here. There's an IP decay, but there's an EM induction. They might have different time scales, and can we possibly separate them out? And ultimately, in this case, we're just interested in that IP. What really got us working on this, well, just mentioned there's both grounded sources, so that's what we're seeing here in that typical horseshoe configuration. And then there's also inductive sources. And this was the one that really grabbed us from a scientific viewpoint. In the Cleek-White-Cho area, there was two pipes that were sitting up there. And at the early times, this was completely negative and this was positive. So if you look at the decays, at DO27, which is the one down here, it actually starts off positive, and then a little bit later goes to zero crossing again, and then it stays negative. We flipped signs on all these so that negatives here are actually the IP part of it. And DO18 is consistently negative, so it's IP all the way. So we're going to break it up into two parts. First of all, the grounded IP, and then we'll do the inductive source. So for the basic equations are here's the equations that we used yesterday in the frequency domain, and we also have Ohm's law, J is equal to sigma E. And in time domain, if there's no IP, we have these equations with J is equal to sigma E also. If the conductivity is frequency dependent, and we're going to use, I showed resistivity yesterday, I prefer to work in terms of conductivity. So now we have complex conductivity at very high frequencies, and we'd call that sigma in the electrical conductivity at very high frequency, sigma infinity is up here, it's high. As you go down to lower frequencies, the conductivity decreases. This is sort of the shape of the curve, and here is the complex part of it. That's the quadrature. The expression for the complex conductivity. So this is now basically written in a cold format. We've got tau, which is a delay. C is a parameter. Eta is your intrinsic chargeability, goes between 0 and 1. And sigma infinity is the electrical conductivity that you'd obtain without any chargeability at all. So that's going to be our base. And so you can see this depends upon frequency, and if we took a Fourier transform of this, or an inverse transform of that, of sigma of omega, we'd actually get sigma of t. And so this is kind of like a response function that tells us how effectively the conductivity varies in time. But that's also, it's a very confusing statement for a lot of people. You say, well, the conductivity varies in time. What we're really talking about here is that if you put a rock and you subjected it to an impulsive field, then the electrical conductivity that you would measure has got a response that kind of goes like this. So let's first of all do a simulation of what's going on. Notice that we've got a J here. So here's Maxwell's equations. We've got J, and we could substitute in Ohm's law. J is equal to sigma E. And then you could solve this at each frequency. And then you could convert back from frequency to time and see what things look like in time. We can also solve those equations directly in the time domain. So here's our equations in the time domain. But in the time domain, so if we have this in the frequency domain, if we do the Fourier transform of that, now we're going to have a convolution of sigma with E. So the current density that you're going to get out in time is really the convolution of that sigma P, that kind of impulse response function that we have. So it has that big negative with the electric field. Okay. So that can be coded. That can be coded in, and you could solve what the responses would be like in two different ways, either by solving in the frequency, doing transform, or you could solve directly in the time and time step. So let's look at an observed response. We've got a uniform on time here for the current. Now we're going to turn that current off, right? And then we get this negative here. That's the EM induction. And notice this guy is going a little bit above zero, and that's what we want. So now if we look down at this at a much smaller, more refined angle, we see it's negative here, and then now we've got a positive IP response. So I've changed back to make IP positive again, it's just okay, so that's the guy that we're really trying to define in this. So you can see, remember in the MIM example, when I showed the pseudosections, I said, oh, well, we can't see these guys at really great offset. Well, that's why the signals here are just really small, and you're looking at small parts of a secondary signal, so you're going to have a hard time trying to find that. So let's define the IP datum. So we're going to define our IP datum as whatever observation we've got, doesn't matter in here, minus the fundamental response, which is the solution of Maxwell's equation with sigma infinity. So what this is telling us is that in time, we're going to any part of the signal that is different from what the response would be if it had no chargeability, that is actually going to be our IP datum. So we're going to have IP as a function of time. So calling that the fundamental response, I think that's been around for a while. Richard Smith, back 2 decades ago, when he did some really good work on inductive source IP. He used that notation. We've kept that, and I think a lot of other people have used that. So that's the fundamental response. So this curve is now very interesting. If we've got our decay as a function of time, so our observations are this guy here. So it's going to start out here, negative, and then there's a zero crossing, and it goes up, and then it's positive, and then it decays. Okay, so that's what happened. If you didn't have chargeable material, if nothing was chargeable, you just have something that comes like this. So that's our fundamental response here. Okay, I subtract this from that. So here's the observations, and I get this red line here, which is the IP response. So you can see what happens. There's a few domains here. There's an early time, okay, where there's really no difference between what's measured and the fundamental. So this is the immediate time after you've turned this off. You've got lots of electromagnetic induction. The IP is really small. Actually, that IP is like 2 orders of magnitude less than that. And so there's a time in here where you've basically got just EM induction. So this is what I was actually talking about yesterday when I was saying, oh, let's look at the really early times for these kinds of systems, and we could take these early times and invert them to get a conductivity. Okay. There's also a late time in here. You know, the induction part's gone. So the only thing that you're seeing here is the IP signal. So you've got an early time completely dominated by EM induction. You've got a late time completely dominated by the IP. But you have a very important and often extensive middle time in which these two things are just kind of mushed together. They're overlapped. And the question is, can you do anything about that? So that's the part that we're going to try to concentrate on, is separating out the EM from the IP in this region, so that if you ordinarily just had this part here, that you'd extend it back and get another order of magnitude. Here's the same example that I showed you yesterday, but this is going to have chargeable blocks. So these blocks here, A1, A2, A3, A4, they have different conductivities. So they actually have the same conductivities that we talked about yesterday. So here's the most conductive, next most conductive, that's resistive, and that is no contrast at all. And here's our cross sections. In addition to that, we're going to make 2 of these blocks chargeable. So we're going to have A2 and A3. So we're going to have that non-conductive or non-resistive block chargeable, as well as this guy here. So this is going to be a big conductor but not chargeable. This is going to be a big resistor but not chargeable. These two guys are different. And they're both going to be the same. Chargeability of 0.1 and half a second decay time. And we're just going to model this C equal 1 by 1. So for the forward modeling, we're going to use that same horseshoe and going to measure the same potentials that we did before and just see what things look like and how that all works. So the DC data, again, I showed you this yesterday, so it looked like that. Transfer them to apparent conductivity, and get these two guys. If we look at the off-time data, so these are decay curves at the 4 blocks. At block A1, okay, here's our observed data. At block A2, so this was, remember this was chargeable. So we don't see any particular happening. At block A2, this was chargeable, and notice that we've got this zero crossing that's sitting here. It starts negative, and then goes back to positive. And block A3 also has a definite zero crossing, so that's chargeable, and A4 doesn't have it. So we can see from here that there's two negative transients. Oh, I didn't mention that. Oh. There's two negative transients that are coming in. And the IP response that we're actually looking for is this red line here. So there's a region in here where it's still pretty low compared to the fundamental, but there's some stuff up here where it's actually quite high. So if we look at this particular time, remember what I was going to say something, but I can't remember what I was going to say.
Just a question, though.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, here we're just here we're looking at different times. So that's 0.5 milliseconds on the range. So we're back up in here. We're computing the EM response time. Here we're actually getting into the IP. You can start to see him on the data, and here we're really on late time, 130 milliseconds, where we basically see these two chargeable bodies. And very late time, it's even more accentuated.
Just a question, though.
Yeah.
When you go off that slide.
Yeah, go back.
So when you look at A3, and the early IP effect is less than it is at later times. So is the EM current suppressing the chargeable response, or is it just a side effect of the model that you're using to model the...
Try this again, where are we?
So A3, early time, red line, the actual IP response is smaller than it is at later times.
Right here.
Yeah. So is that an effect of the EM current suppressing the chargeability response, or is that just an effect of the model, the cold model? Because normally you'd start with the secondary voltage as being at the turn-off, and then it decays to zero at late times. So you've got a natural increase to middle times and then a decrease at late times.
I have to think.
Because it's less in A2 than it is in A3.
Yeah.
So A3 is less.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's got to do with the fact that we've got a conductor. It's got nothing to do with the fact that we're using a particular coal model. I'll think about that. Okay.
Because that's important in terms of looking at early times in IP as well.
Well, we're still like 2 orders of magnitude down or an order of magnitude down here. So by the time we're into this region, yeah, it does seem to be all
Okay.
But potentially so you've got a half a 0.5 milliseconds. What is it? But I mean, things are still charging up.
There's no current running other than the EM current.
I'll think about that. There's something in there. I don't want to just say something that's wrong because it's been captured and then really embarrassing. Okay.
No, it's
yeah.
It's really important to understand all of the interactions.
Exactly.
What you're saying.
Yeah. So we could do EM coupling. So we've got the IP data is the forward model response with everything in it minus the fundamental, and we could do that with let's say the true. We know what the true conductivity is here, right? So if we look at 80 milliseconds and then computed what this response is at 80 seconds, we kept, here's the observations, here's the fundamental, and here's the resultant IP data. So that gets rid of a lot of stuff in here, and here's a better estimate of what the IP data is at 80 milliseconds. In here, we could do any conductivity estimate for a background. Remember when we first started doing DC resistivity in IP, there was always this question about, okay, how well do you need to know the background conductivity in order to do the IP removal or the IP inversion? And in a lot of cases, we found that, well, even just a half space wasn't all that bad. Do something that was kind of approximate would be better. What happens here if you just use a half space for decoupling? The fundamental just from half space looks like this. Here's the observations. If you subtract those two, you get something like this. So now that's actually pretty bad, right? Because we've got this big IP response up here. That's not good. So it's very much a false artifact. So a half space is not going to work very well. So how do we estimate the background conductivity? Yep. Okay, so how do we estimate the background conductivity? Well, we got a couple ways, right? We've got the DC resistivity, that's what's usually done. And we could go ahead and invert those. The other is, and this is what I was advocating yesterday, is there's a region here that is uncontaminated by IP. So we can measure these early times and then use those to get a background conductivity. And then use that conductivity for decoupling.
Doug, what about if your IP response comes from a middle layer and not from your first layer? So your first layer would be controlling your early times, and the IP might just be present in the late times or the middle times according to where the body is. Right.
Yeah, fair enough. If you're inverting too early at times in here, you're not getting down to the conductivity that you're not getting down to the depths that you really want. You also have the DC that could be working a bit for you. So yeah, sure, there are definitely times that this is not seeing deep enough for you, but. Yeah, again, it's at least some way of getting some information about the about that top conductivity. And as I said yesterday, inverting a few of those time channels actually gave us, in some cases, a better resistivity estimation. And we're going to be looking at that same example here, where we happen to have a background of 100 ohm meters or something. So we're going to invert things in the same way we always did. The DCIP inversion is actually inverted with a SIMPEG module. So this is actually freely available, and Lindsay can talk a little bit more about SIMPEG. For the DC, we used a 1 over R cubed depth dependence. The time domain inversion was done through our UBC code. Showed you this yesterday, so that was the DC resistivity inversion. So we've got this is true, and we've got a pretty reasonable representation. This is not perhaps the greatest display, but we definitely have higher conductors in A1, slightly lower there. That's kind of resistive, and there's a bit of background, but it's not bad. So if we take that conductivity model and we put in that, do a forward Maxwell on that, subtract that from the observations, we end up with something that looks like this. So here was the observations, there's the predicted, because remember that was that big conductor there, so that's going to make a difference. And then we we subtract, and we get something that looks like that. So yeah, that's not bad. It's definitely improved things. We've got we've improved the size of this body here. That's now becoming a major IP anomaly, and this is smaller here. So compared to half space, where the DC resistivity is a better choice for estimating the fundamental and removing that background than the half space. Okay, so now let's look at the time domain inversion. Here we only had six time channels, and felt like, okay, that's the early stuff that we can use. So working with the 6 time channels, then here was one case observed and predicted. Then we estimated or inverted those to get this 3D conductivity structure here. So again, you notice that we've done a good job at kind of recovering that electrical resistivity.
Doug, could I ask a question about your previous example first?
Sure.
Has your conductivity modeling overestimated the conductivity effect? If you go back one more slide, we look at the result, you see that body 3, or the top right-hand corner, has a higher chargeable response than the bottom left-hand corner, even though they have the same size and chargeability and depth. So why is that?
It's not a perfect decoupling. That's my guess.
Yeah.
Or is it just that the...
I mean, we've certainly made a difference between here and here, right? So we can,
absolutely.
so by changing that conductivity, we've helped ourselves. If we look at the yeah, I don't know. We're starting to get, like pretty subtle changes, and this is the main thing here. I think is that we've sort of reduced the amplitude of this guy, which I think is appropriate, but importantly, kind of got here. We seem to have increased a little bit here, but I judge that at this point to be, like a next level of something to look at. So here we go. We've got early time channels. We get something that looks like this, and yeah, now here, I guess this was more your point here. We're now slightly larger here than here, and I think they were both the same to start with. So we've actually reversed things here. This one's larger here than here. Now we kind of made it the other way. No, actually, I think I think that was larger. That's what I was. Huh. Oops. So there might be a little bit of confusion on my part, because I know we did this stuff a number of times, and now I'm less certain that these two are exactly the same chart, because this is the true IP. So that's with the right background and everything, and this is a little bit stronger than that, and that's what we're seeing here. So there's some consistencies. If we just look at this and this, there might be an inconsistency in something that I said about those two being exactly the same on the trial basis.
But from the point of view of the incline, that we have the DC result that gets rid of the false anomaly.
Yeah. I mean, that's still a little bit there, but yeah, for the most part, we've done pretty well. So I think that the takeaway message is going to be here: A, that it can be done; B, that you really need to be operating in 3D. You need to be doing your modeling in 3D. And yeah, somehow you need to have a pretty reasonable approximation to the 3D conductivity to do that.
Because there are a lot of inversions done on EM responses that are not IP responses, resulting in drilling of targets which are not charging.
Yeah, so in this case, this would be standard to get this DC model out, because you do a 3D DC model. Then the only thing is you need to forward model that at whatever, in time, compute those responses, subtract them off, and you have a reduced data set. So I think that would be a really big step forward for a lot of things. So then we've got an inversion workflow. So that is to recover sigma infinity using those early times, or compute the responses. Then we've got actually a set of linearized equations, because we can still do everything in terms of linearization just the way we had before. And then we're going to recover a pseudo chargeability. And this is the result of that. So here's the, yeah, so this guy is bigger on the true value, unquestionably. So he's these are true values. Inverting with a half space, we end up with 3 bodies. Inverting with DC, you've got kind of just a little bit of perhaps representation there, and inverting with time domain, you get that. So I think that's a really nice result, right? That's a real step forward. So that's the inversion of this. If we take those same results and do kind of a volume rendering, you get about the same thing. You get a chance to see a little bit more at a cutoff level what the interpreter has been using time domain versus DC, and especially using half space. So the take home here, early time data usually discarded, don't. You can use those data, recover a conductivity model, and you may actually want to kind of work both with those early time data that recovers sigma infinity and the DC data. Remember, DC data, though, you wouldn't expect the same conductivity, though, right? Because DC data give you like resistivity modified. I mean, it's got the chargeability effects built into it. So they are not the same thing. And generally don't worry too much about that, especially if chargeabilities are small, 0.1 or 0.15 or something like that. But you do have to remember that the resistivity that you get out of DC includes all of the chargeability effects. So it's going to be biased down.
So you could say it's not a true resistivity?
Pardon me?
So it's not a true resistivity, you could say?
Well, it is not what people would ordinarily consider to be the true resistivity.
That's important too when you're doing a comparison, because a lot of the cases when you're doing a comparison with everyone data, for instance, and you're running an inversion, they want to see a match with downhole low resistivity, for instance. There's an explanation. If there's you're doing a comparison then with ground IP from airborne IP, you couldn't expect to get that.
Yeah, and there's lots of other things that could throw a monkey wrench into that stuff too, right? In one case, you've got sort of inductive sources that are going on. In the other case, you've got grounded sources and fractures and things that definitely cause some variation.
So this handles negative EM. What about positive EM? We see a lot of cases where you get negative on one side of a conductive vertical body and you get positive EM on the other side, so it actually changes sign depending on where you're transmitting from to. So this handles
Yeah.
early time negatives, but what about early time positives due to the EM?
Well, I mean, forget about the IP effect. I don't think I don't think there should be a problem in handling negatives and positives. If you take an inversion algorithm, I'm not exactly sure what connectivity structure you're.
But can the cold model, I guess, handle the early time positive EM as well?
Well, the cold model doesn't. I mean, it's totally divorced from what the EM is doing. If the EM is positive or negative. Yeah, that's not.
Well, I guess I'm saying, can you actually model the positive EM in the EM part of the inversion?
Well, I'm not 100% connected with you, but what I can tell you here is that we put in a cold model, okay? So that's fine. So that'll tell you how things are charging up and discharging, if you like, as a function of time. And certainly, especially when we talk about the inductive source, now we have to be really serious about stuff charging up and stuff decaying, right? So that things get pretty complicated actually with an inductive source. But so long as you can take, let's forget that material was chargeable, okay? But you just got some positive and negative EM response. So I mean, maybe it's, if you imagine measuring B field, for instance, and you've got basically a current that's going this way, and you're on one side of that current, you get positive, you're on the other side, negative. That's no problem.
So it's going to
that's just not an issue, right? It's just like somebody was asking yesterday, well, what do you do with negative IP? Well, I mean, negative IP it's just not an issue. It just models out. So depending on where your receiver is and where your little block of chargeability is, you're going to get different, different charges on that thing.
Because the currents are just going to be
going to go in that direction, and like that's fine, no problem. So all of those things are kind of they arise because you're trying to look at data and make sort of a direct interpretation from them. And the data get a little bit wonky sometimes. They're positive or negative, whatever. But really, the mathematics is very straightforward, and sometimes the data are negative, sometimes they're positive. Handle that. So we can do that very easily for the EM inversion. And now you add IP on that. And now if the currents in that body happen to be going this way at this time, right? And a little bit later, they're going this way. So just the same as we saw in that grounded source yesterday. And we got two things moving through. We've got this inductive stuff coming from the wire, and these other things. So if you actually look in your, at a particular point, and you watch what's happening as a function of time, sometimes the electric field's going this way, sometimes it's going this way, sometimes it's bigger. Every time that electric field points in that direction, if that material is chargeable, we start to build up charges there. Now you change over, you're building up charges out of this way. And
so this is a much more natural environment than in terms of getting it right.
Yeah, I believe we actually have it right. We spent a lot of time, especially on the inductive source. We did the whole thing. Sagi and I argued for 2 years trying to scratch our hair, really try to figure out how to do it. In the end, you look back on these things and say, well, but of course, that's kind of what has to happen. Sagi has written a very, very nice paper. I'm extremely proud of it. We published it in Geophysical Journal International. It's two years ago. We went very carefully through every step of this whole business of looking at inductive source IP. tested every assumption, tried to understand what physically is going on, when you can make one assumption, when you can't, how bad the assumption is, and not. That paper, I hope, will kind of end up being a landmark here in this stuff, because we really did lay out everything. And then once we had that, then going to the grounded source was like crazy, because grounded source is really easy compared to inductive source. So what you're seeing here is really the outgrowth of material that I published in 2000. But I think that's a great paper that Sagi did, and would urge you to read it. Not for the lighter part, it's not. Well, I was going to say it's not bedtime reading, but it actually might be, because you started while you're sitting in bed.
I think one of the problems with layer 1 IP actually is not necessarily once you can model the negative, that's sort of intrinsic. I think what we found is sometimes hard to determine if it's IP or is it noise, because sometimes negatives is just you've got run out of signal in your overridder, which is the ground, and it's not necessarily an IP. I mean, so then you have to start looking at the case on a more geological, is it geologically coherent that are there? So isn't that?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, so sometimes, and we'll talk about that in a second. So you get these negative transceivers, right? But you know, sometimes it actually doesn't go negative, right? It just kind of dips down a little bit. And so the question is, can you see that in the data or not?
Yeah.
And the issue then that becomes important is if you're going to invert those time domain data for determining the electrical conductivity, then you really don't want to be using those IP contaminated data. Otherwise, you're going to get screwed up a little bit. You're going to get resistive structures that are in there. So ultimately, there's perhaps some back and forth that's going, and that's going to be the last part of Sagi's thesis. Got pretty much mapped out. So you start with a phase 1, you do EM decoupling on the IP, but now you've got an IP signature, so now you could do an IP decoupling on the EM, and I think like 1 or 2 iterations back and forth, you've got a way of kind of separating those 2 things out. The other approach to this is more the Europeans, the Aarhus group, who are basically saying, well, we've got a complex connectivity, we're just going to put everything in all at once and do it. And that's also a very valid approach. So I think there's a couple of people that are kind of working on this. But this approach that we have, what I like about it is that it's pretty robust, and by breaking things into 2 stages and kind of always knowing what the assumptions you have at any particular stage, it seems to be very helpful. So those are our takeaways. And now we'll do another example. So this is the Flick-like show. I showed this briefly yesterday. The area is up in sort of northern Canada in the Slave Province. A kimberlite pipe. This is a traditional cartoon. It's an explosive event that comes up from deep. The diamonds are stable at 115 kilometers or something. And you get an explosive event, it erupts. There's various kimberlites, objects that are here. There's a hyperbyssal kimberlite, which is a volcanic plastic, and there's pyroclastic. And then there's some lake sediments. So the way these things are often found is, well, visually, there's like a lake. The lakes have sediments in them, so they're often conductive. And then they're also perhaps magnetic that's coming in here. So those were the kinds of things that people first look for. There's going to be 2 that we're interested in, DO18 and DO27. We'll talk a bit more about why they're interested. I showed you actually also this yesterday. These are time domain data. The great thing about it is that when you fly in these surveys over top, this is a frequency domain EM survey, the two pipes kind of shine out. The AeroTam system first flown, there was an AeroTam 1 that was flown, and so this is a time domain. This is one of the earliest times for this system, and the blue is negative. When that first happened, and those were the days that people were starting to see this, like more than once, people couldn't quite figure out why in the system you're getting negatives. Peter Vidal wrote a fabulous paper about this time, maybe even earlier. I'm not sure exactly what that schedule was, where he looked at these coincident loop systems. And he showed that if you could get a negative transient out of it, the only way of getting a negative transient out of that is if you have an IP response. That information may have been in the literature, but I know there was a lot of people that were looking at these data and A, questioning the system, and B, they're saying, well, look, we don't believe that. We're either going to throw the data away, but in that, you couldn't do that here because everything was negative for all times. And so sometimes I know people just took the absolute value. Okay, we can't do anything with that. Let's take the absolute value of the data and then invert its conductivity. AeroTam, because people weren't believing their system, we did a new system that was the AeroTam 2. I think that flew a year or something later than the AeroTam 1. And not only did it repeat those negatives, but it greatly reduced the noise level. So there's no question that it was there. VTAM came along in 2004, nailed it down, and yeah, so it was completely clear that it had these negative values. And then did some groundwork I guess that was early, to see that there was negative results. So that's kind of the basis for the airborne frequency and time domain EM. And then what we wanted to do was to kind of invert those data. Oh, this is interesting. This is a movie put together by Dave Marchant. So Dave wrote a time domain forward modeling code that basically did the time stepping. So it didn't compute things at a whole bunch of frequencies and then invert. It just basically time stepped. So what you're seeing here, you can imagine a vertical magnetic dipole transmitter up here, and you're going to turn this off. So you've got a loop of currents going like this. You turn it off, and at the surface of the Earth, just like now we're talking what we did yesterday, right? We got these induced currents, and they're going to be circular, right? And then they're going to diffuse outward and downward. Now, there's going to be a block in here that is chargeable. Sorry, I should have shown this. Help. So we've got a background of 100 ohm meters. Here's a chargeable block that's sort of 60 by 60 by 60, 40 meters beneath the surface. Here's the cold parameters for that. So what's going to happen is that the current gets shut off. It's going to diffuse down in here. And now the moment that you've got an electric field that's crossing that boundary, okay, you're going to start to get some sort of charge buildup. Now, this is because of the IP effect. So let me try to make sure we don't confuse everybody here. We talked about galvanic currents going through and that causing charges that are built up on the outside. Absolutely, that still exists. In addition to that, there's stuff that's going to be going on inside here, okay, that is the polarization effect, so that if there's any electrical current that's going through there, it's going to cause all those little particles to sort of kind of bunch up against the little pore throat to make a polarization response here. So we're not going to talk about the galvanic charges. That's kind of done. When I'm talking about charges now, we're talking about the induced polarization charges. So the initial state is that we don't even see the block. There's nothing happening here. These currents are going to diffuse down into the earth, but they're going to be gradually interacting with the block. Okay. So now we see that they're coming down into the earth, and you can see the directions of the currents. Okay. So the bulk of what you're seeing here is just that diffusion of that primary field down into the earth, okay? But there has been currents that are crossing this block and charging it up. And we're going to now look at what happens a little bit later in time as these, and see what the manifestation of those charges were. Oh, I forgot to say, so basically we're kind of here. So if you had a receiver that was kind of right on this, right in the middle here, here's your time decay curve. This is, so what you're receiving is just, the conductivity, result of conductivity of the earth, and you see that here. Now, what we're going to do is but all while this is doing, this block is kind of charging up a little bit, right? Because there's currents that are flowing through. And now what we're going to do is to come over here, and then there's actually going to be a crossover, which means that if there's a crossover, that means that the currents must be kind of going in an opposite direction here, and that's what's happening with those charges. So here was the block, all charged up, right? And now the currents that are flowing this way, they flow in the opposite direction. So your polarization currents flow in opposite directions to your primary currents, right? And so now these guys are flowing like this in that block, and we're now kind of sitting right here. So if you're sitting in here, now the currents are kind of going the other ways. So now you're going to see, now I'm going to see a negative. And that's at this particular time scale. Then it gradually takes away. Okay? You can watch it once more.
So is that forward free?
I'm sorry?
Is that forward model free? The code?
The code. I don't think we've got this one that's really available, but we must be pretty close to having something that can do this. It's kind of like one of those things. It's not quite, but it's kind of on the list.
Somebody's code is available, but at this point it's not easy to jump into.
Yeah.
Unless you're sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Our goal is actually to make all of these things freely available, and then at some point to ask for a quid pro quo, right? I've known a number of people who have said, oh, they're going to try to make things open source, and so they make it open source in the sense that, okay, it's freely available, and there's all kinds of accolades, and people are like, oh, great, really love your code, that's great, right? And then that's it. You never hear anything more. You don't get any feedback. You don't get any improvement in that. And that's kind of, doesn't leave you with a good feeling. So, but I think if we can sort of generate something with an expectations like, okay, here it's free, it's available. There's lots of checks on it. We want you to use it. We want you to distribute it. But we also want you to contribute and do things. Then it would be a much more appealing thing. Sorry.
Just wanted to ask a question back a little bit. Remember you said you're thinking about running this process iteratively back and forth. Just to make sure I understand, does that mean you then take that IP response that you calculate using the initial early time DC inversion, and then basically remove that from the data and run another DC inversion, and then use that as the basis for your IP calculations back and forth? Is that what you meant?
I think so. Let me just tell what I was going to do. So you start out, you've got these three regimes.
Yep.
So we'll take the early time data, generate a connectivity model, there's our fundamental, and now we'll subtract that from everything, right? Then we've got this IP, IP model, right? We can actually calculate those, the responses due to that. So now we're going to just calculate the response from IP and kind of go back, and then that would now adjust maybe the data that we're putting in. So I think we're on, that's what you were saying. Yeah, and it's a semi-pedestrian way of doing it, but you can see that one of the reasons that prompted us to do that is that we were looking at a place called Mount Milligan. I've been doing that for years, and there's definitely IP phenomena in those time takers, but they don't go negative, right? They just kind of, they just kind of slip down a little bit, right? And if you don't take that out, you go ahead and you invert them, you get these great big resistors there, right? And you realize, like, okay, that's probably not right. So it's then a matter of trying to see if you can fix it up a bit.
I guess one of the things that's happening while we're seeing the IP much more is because of the greater powering the systems and the better signal to noise ratio. So exactly what you're saying, the layer gates are now being much better defined. So some of those things that in the past we couldn't see are coming through much more often now.
Right.
Big VTEM 35-meter loops and things like that. It's like huge moments, right?
Yeah.
Can I recommend some terminology for that iterative step?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Shaking it down.
Shaking it down. Okay.
Shake down the data, shake down the TM, shake down the IP.
Yeah. That's okay. We'll remember that. Anyway, so that's. So what's our inversion workflow then? It's the same for this example as it was previously. Step one is to get the conductivity. I've actually got there might be some worthiness to spending an extra 15 minutes where we kind of look a little bit more at some aspects of these TKC data that I think you might be interested in. Because I'm glossing over this here right now. But this was a challenge, just trying to figure out what do we use for background conductivity there. We wanted to do it all from airborne. If we did the time domain, the VTEM, which was probably the higher quality, then there's, these are data which even the earliest time channels were just not really useful. And so we got rid of them. The only data that we used for the 3D inversion of the time domain is the stuff that's not whited out. Okay, so that means there's lots of stuff in here that's not very good. Over the DOAT deposit, the DigEm data actually had a pretty nice signature. So we were able to do a 3D frequency domain inversion of the DigEm data, 3D time domain inversion of this over a limited part, and we kind of went back and forth to do a cooperative inversion, and ended up with a 3D conductivity model. So it actually looks like this. So it's, the higher conductivity is down here, 27. Cross sections look like that.
Sorry, just one quick question.
Yeah, no, please.
I'm just wondering on the frequency domain, over the top deposit that is clearly negative on from the airtime and the VTEM.
Yep.
Is there anything in the frequency domain that sort of hints that there is an IP on the data itself?
Yeah, we looked really hard at this, and we suspect it is, but you know, we weren't able to dig it out. So this is all going to be part of the shakedown. Okay, we're going to try to look more carefully and see if we can pick something up. That's a really great question.
What was the frequency for the DJ?
Usually starts around 400.
400 to, I can't remember whether it got up to 130,000 or it was a little bit less.
So there's not enough time to charge up before it discharges because of the frequency.
Yeah, we didn't see any like really clear aspects of IP in that frequency domain data.
So doing both would give you a good diagnostic of IP?
Right. Well, I think so. We'd actually like to investigate further extracting IP from frequency domain data. I don't know, have people here had experience with that?
Probably too quick to charge it up enough to measure it. Or
Well, as I'll show you in a second, I think maybe for the permafrost stuff, which has very fast decays, then maybe efficiency is okay.
I've worked with a lot of frequency domain data, and that's why I asked, because I haven't heard of this, so that's why I asked.
Well, theoretically, there should be something there. This is significant chargeability of the body, and yeah, we'll go back and take a look.
Is that data really available?
It is.
Okay.
Yes. So we have permission to distribute these data. And yeah, you'll be able to get it through the GeoSci website.
Okay.
We're not quite set up, I guess, sure exactly where we are with that, but we're kind of we're almost there. But we do have permission.
Okay. So we can send you an email.
The company's Peregrine Diamonds is they're the current owners. They're actually pretty excited about this because they feel there's potential there, and they're looking to sell it. So they're actually pretty happy that we can do anything with it. They're just concerned that we don't say something that might be negatively impact upon the potential diamond potential here. But now we're going to decouple, and I think these slides are really good. So here's 130 microseconds. Here's the observed. Okay. So we've got this conductivity structure. We take that, do a 3D forward modeling, time domain, Maxwell's equations, and here's the fundamental we get. And now if we subtract, so all of this stuff here is just EM. And what this does, it brings out some very interesting things. So there's A1 up here, so that really is corresponding to that. So it hasn't really changed that very much. But there's two other places here in which there is chargeable material. So we actually ended up with 4 places ultimately that we're going to concentrate on here. A1, 2, 3, 4, all of which are chargeable. So that's at 130 microseconds. Here's what happens at 410. So here's the data, right? So now it's confused. You got positives and negatives. What's going on? And here's the fundamental. And if you do that subtraction, you get that. Yeah, that's what we got. Okay, we're good to go. So yeah, just two big whopping IP anomalies. Here are your observations. Here's what you get up. So that's our decoupling. Now we do the inversion. I have to tell you that this paper that Sagi wrote a couple of years ago, where we really looked at every aspect that we possibly could with respect to linearizing the system and under what conditions it would go, and looking at the vortex currents and trying to figure out what kind of a reference field you have. The real challenge with inductive source is that you don't have a constant reference field to think about charging stuff up, right? In DC, in a DC where you've got a grounded source, like you know what direction those currents are traveling in, and so therefore, okay, it's going to charge up, and the currents are, charge polarization currents are going to be along that direction. Okay, that's it. But now if you've got an inductive source, you're sitting at one particular point in time in some location, and now you've got stuff coming in. And you look at the electric field, it's going this way, it's going this way, it's going this way, and it's just slipping around. And every time it points in one direction, there's something going to be charging up, and then this is going to be charging on discharging. I mean, it's a mess. And so we had to try to figure out some way of working with that. And basically what we did is say, well, at any particular, if I'm at any location in the ground, at any if I'm sitting here as a function of time and I'm looking at what the electric field is doing, there is a particular time at which the electric field is a maximum and it's pointing in a particular direction. Okay, let's take that. So we take that, and then that means for each point in that 3D volume, you actually have a different location of, or different angle for your reference field, but you've now got that, and now you can tie everything to that and move on. So you can see there are still, there's going to be some approximations, but at the same time, we've got a pretty good handle on at least what the major contribution is. So all of that is now just buried into a single one sentence saying, oh, well, we're going to calculate sensitivities from the conductivity, and we're going to go ahead and invert this into ordinary. So here's the recovered chargeability, pseudo-chargeability at 130 microseconds. And you can see the bulk of stuff is up here at PO18. There's this guy here, and this guy here. Okay. If we go later, then you can see the magnitude here has decreased. The chargeability at A2 and A3 is kind of lessened, and the bulk chargeability is happening right here. So there's definitely things that are happening in time. You can see immediately here, there's at least two different kinds of rocks with different time scales here for chargeability. So now we can do one more step, right? We can so we've done the inversions at any of these pipes, okay? And now at each cell, we've got kind of an intrinsic, we've got a pseudo chargeability as a function of time. I'm not sure, did anybody ever read a paper that a guy by the name of Yuval and I did? This is like a long time ago. Yuval was kind of an interesting guy. His name was Yuval Zudman, but he's a bit of an eclectic character. And when we went to publish this paper, and the text of the paper really had to do with looking to see if we could extract coal parameters from DC resistivity and IP data. And what we did is we successively inverted each time channel. So I do a 2D inversion of each time channel of data, and then that meant at each pixel we'd have a pseudo chargeability as a function of time, and then you could take that and then do a fit to a coal parameter and then see what you get. Okay, so we did that, and now we're doing exactly the same thing here. So invert multiple time channels. So there, I showed you 2, but actually inverted 10 different time channels. That means that each pixel in the Earth, we have 10 different time estimates of the superchargeability. We could go ahead and invert them and recover coal moles. Okay, so that's what was.
So what you're saying is on the decay, you're doing you're inverting for each different time channel. So the equivalent of having, let's say, 10 different layers. Is that what it is?
No, that's close. Sorry. So, for instance, at 130 milliseconds or microseconds. Okay.
Yeah.
So now we've got 3D kind of 3D coverage.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got the IP data after that. So now we're going to have a linear relation that those IP data are equal to some sensitivity matrix times an intrinsic chargeability or some chargeability. Okay?
Yep.
So now we can go ahead and invert that. That's a gravity inversion. Right? That's like the regular DC. So we keep that same sensitivity, and then we now invert another time channel. So that means at each time channel, we've got a 3D volume of chargeabilities. Okay, now let's just look at a particular pixel in that. So we take this pixel, and we've actually got, as a function of time, we've got 10 values of the pseudo chargeability. So it might be going down like that. So now that's like an intrinsic decay.
Yes.
And now we'll take those and do a coal modeling of those, and you find like, oh, tau is equal to this, chargeability. Okay?
Yes. Okay. Thanks.
So that's, we took A1, A2, A3, A4, and this is what we get. So A4 was the DO27, and here's the time constant. So we're just getting eta, chargeability, and tau, and it separates out like this. So all the rocks over here in DO27, when you look at them, they all have large time constants that's associated with it and moderate chargeability. The other guys are pretty similar. So A1 was DO18, so they're here. These rocks here in A2 are the yellow, and these rocks here A3 are the red. So, I don't know, you can be a judge, like, okay, are we actually starting to see that, maybe there's some classification. Certainly it's not like a scattergun thing where things are all over the map, but quite clearly to first order we see this and all this stuff over here. To second order, maybe we're starting to pick out, a few things.
And your C is constant, right?
C is constant, yeah. Yeah, just like that. So there's a lot more to this story that we're going to pursue. We've got rocks from there, so we've got drill core. We have done some petrophysical analysis ourselves, and there's a guy by the name of Randy Enken. People know him. Maybe I guess the counterpart to Don Emerson here kind of runs physical properties lab at in Victoria, and we're looking at all of the resistivities and petrophysical measurements. So from the perspective of kimberlite exploration, here's where we are. We've got, we put everything together. I can elaborate a little bit more on this if you want, but basically from the geophysics, we get these different rock units, and we can actually compare them with the drones. I'm actually going to fire that up because I think it will only take about 10 minutes and it'll be kind of interesting. So here's a summary for that. So I'm going to build up that geologic rock model. This is basically it. This is now our procedure for how do we work with inductive source or grounded source. So if we've got the initial data, we're going to first invert the data, early time data, or the DC data to recover background conductivity. So here was for the grounded source, here was for the inductive source. So we invert those, get the conductivity. Then we subtract or regenerate the fundamentals, and we subtract that from the observations to get the IP data. And then we're going to invert the IP data to get chargeabilities, and then we're going to extract to get individual code parameters. And hopefully that allows us to distinguish between different rock types. So let me just dig up this other guy because we're kind of right in the flow of things here.
We've got to talk at our government department at 11.
Okay.
So if we go off and come back at 12 or 12:30 or after lunch.
Okay, that sounds good.
Before you start that,
Yeah.
you're in an ideal situation with that, where you have the degen data and the time domain data. So what happens if you only have the time domain data?
Good question. I think under those circumstances, we've actually got to kind of start things off with just a complex conductivity and start to invert for cold parameter suite and see where we go. We haven't done that yet, but I think that would be a logical step. Yeah, otherwise you just kind of so I just want to breeze. I'm just going to really breeze through this, maybe 10 minutes. But what we wanted to do here was to see how far we could go with just airborne geophysics in a diamond kimberlite exploration project. There's a lot of stories. We could spend a whole night just talking about all of the various kinds of things that went on with TKC and the gold rush of northern Canada, and just how poor decisions were made, how it actually affected the stock market, and crash of the diamond industry. There's just so many things that are kind of bound up in here, and there were so many times where you realize, like, okay, if they had done a little bit more analysis, they would not have spotted that drill hole there, or they would have done something else here, and it could have changed completely that entire picture. So our goal was then to say, okay, well, how far could we go if we just had airborne geophysics? So this is very much done in retrospect, but I think it shows me where it could be. So we've got, we're going to put everything in a 7-step process. We've got 2 kimberlite pipes, and got some exploration challenges. I've talked about the negatives. And really our question, here's the question. How much can we get out of this, what information can we get out of the kimberlite complex? And here's the one that we're interested in, like, can we build a geologic rock model using airborne geophysics? Okay, how far could we go? So here's our physical property table: density, susceptibility, conductivity, chargeability. The objects that we've got here are, I talked a bit about them before, they're just various kimberlite units, and so different combinations of properties. For the surveys, we had DigEm, VTEM, the AeroTEM, and the DigEm was there, AeroTEM was over here, and VTEM is there. And the DigEm on the broad scale kind of gave these 2 big conductors, also showed the dikes out here. Potential fields, okay, so there's gravity, gradiometry data, and VTEM magnetic data. So these were the data sets. And yeah, we had the 4 pipes. So we're going to do the inversion. So this is kind of like a segue, because Lindsay's going to kind of take you for a walk through the use of SimPeg and inversion algorithms, and basically all of our inversion algorithms are kind of based on the same sort of Gauss-Newton types of systems. But we'll talk about that later this morning or early this afternoon. So potential fields, density. So this stuff kind of comes up and gives rise to a region of low density. The 3D recovered model looks something like that. So blue means really low density, and this is also low. You know, frankly, even just this inversion would have helped them a lot, because their initial geologic models was that this was all one big kimberlite. They thought it was just all coming up, but even this would have said, wait a minute, there's some difference here. Yeah, so now you got one model, okay? Can you kind of distinguish between what's happening? So here's some anomaly contours at a particular level. So we just chosen 2.4 grams per cc, and said, okay, here's going to be an outline of my first estimate of a rock unit that shows low density. Okay, now we go to susceptibility. So here's the magnetic data, and you've got a recovered model. You see that there's a lot of susceptibility associated with this guy compared to that. So there's something different that's going on there. And yeah, so now we're going to make, maybe 3 units. You can appreciate there's a lot of subjectivity in here, and we're not going to advocate like this is exactly how you do it. We're just trying to kind of get through like, okay, this would be a reasonable thing to do, and let's see how we're doing. And we've got stuff happening up here. We've got really high stuff happening here. So we're going to make two units. So one that's associated with this, one that's associated with this high here, and then we still have the density. So we're kind of getting 3 rock. What are we kind of learning at this point? Overall, the kimberlite has a low density. We're expecting an HK unit, hypoabyssal kimberlite, that is supposed to be very high susceptibility. So already we're kind of thinking, well, maybe that region that's exceptionally high might be this HK unit, but whether the other stuff around is a BK or PK, we don't really know. There's not much to distinguish. Okay, but that's something from the potential fields. So that's that's kind of our summary. Maybe 3 different rock units. We've got a background host. We've got some rock unit that has got really low density, and we've got something that is really high susceptibility. Now we come to the electromagnetics. So we've got these that we've seen before. And here was the Digen data, 956 kilohertz. I guess that answers the question that came up previously. So here we're looking shallower, here we're looking deep. The B10 at 130 microseconds is that, 410 is that, and at 5 centimeters. Things yet at 570 milliseconds, there's nothing left except this guy. So there's these 4 chargeable anomalies. Some of them are completely negative, some are actually positive, and then decay. So the conductivity inversion, I said, was challenging. Mike McMillan, John Fournier, Sagi spent a lot of time trying to kind of sort this out. That was our best shot at it, and gives rise to the conductivity. So our interpretation with kappa, rho, and sigma is now that there's some parts here that are really conductive, so they deserve their own unit as far as being a separate rock model. So the blue is now indicative of really low conduct or low resistivity. So there's now 3 extra units. So there's this R3 rock unit. It's got a low density, moderate susceptibility, and a high conductivity. Oh, this was interesting. We argued about this with Theo, Arabanis, and a whole bunch of people for a long time. We showed Theo, who was intimately involved in this, our results for the electrical conductivity, and he said, no way. If we have conductivity that's extending down at depth, and our conjecture was that this high conductivity is connected with the pyroclastic and volcanoclastic material, so it's actually connected with the kimberlite. He says, there's a lake here, there's lots of sediments, there's lots of blue that's there. He says that's the stuff that's really conductive, and he said all you are seeing with conductivity is the lake. That wasn't in accordance with what our inversions were, and so we spent a lot of time doing hypothesis testing, trying to figure out, okay, could we find models that just had everything confined to the top, 50 or 75 meters, still fit the data? We could not do it. In the end, we ended up with a conductivity model that actually looks much more like this, where the concentration of conductivity is below the till level. And that we stand by that today. That's what we think is there. So now let's look at chargeability. So this is what we've just done, right? So here's this is 410 microseconds. Decouple, that's what you get. Do the inversion. So all of the real work goes into trying to figure out what this matrix G is, that sensitivity matrix, but we know it. Check Sagi's paper, 2016. And here's the recovered chargeability model. Looks like that. If we do the early time, it's very different. Looks like that. So early time, late time, very different. So what we're going to do, because these are different, we're actually going to treat them just like an extra model, right? So we've got a density model, we've got a susceptibility model, we've got a conductivity model. So now we're going to use early time pseudo-chargeability as a model, and we're also going to use late time chargeability as a model. So now we've got 5 property models. And now we do that, and we get this, the summary here that I just showed you. So the interpretation of the early and the late time introduces two more quantities. One with a time constant that's really large, 55, the time constant that's 8. And what we see is that this rock unit 4 that we've got, the red guy, has a small time constant, and if we're trying to understand the difference between a PK and a VK, these two volcanoplastic and pyroclastic element, our idea which is still kind of an idea, is that this pyroclastic stuff comes up. It's got it's very porous. It's got larger grain size and stuff. So we would expect maybe that the greater tau might be associated with something called a PK. So that's kind of where, we're not going to be 100% certain of that at this point, but that would be kind of our guess. And here we actually have a background and 5 geophysical rock units. So stack all of that together, and our interpretation kind of comes out like this. So for rock unit 4, it's got low resistivity, moderate susceptibility, moderate conductivity, high early time chargeability, low late time, and small tau. And we might have guessed that that's a PK. But this is really where we are at the end of the geophysics. And then depending how much you think you know or don't know, you might start to attach labels. So this area has been drilled, so we actually know what it is. And what we see here is our geophysical rock units, this, and here is the rock units identified from the drawing. And I think that's a remarkable similarity. So we've got this green stuff out here identified as PK pyroclastic. Actually, and that's the one that's important. That's the one that hosts the diamonds. So if they had some idea about, maybe the volume of this thing or whatever, this would have been an ideal spot to have interrogated. And this VK unit is sitting up here. The HK, the one that's really chargeable, sitting up here. And then there's some stuff up here. These are, they list this as an XVK, which is like a volcanic, it's kind of like a VK that's altered a bit. And that's, so there's nothing, the colors are different, but kind of the geologic interpretation is mostly the same. And now if we put that into the 3D volume, this brings you back to the picture that I showed earlier, but I think there's now a bit more context here with respect to the relationship between the rock used for the drilling and the geophysics. And so we can make this potential identification of what's going on. And really the limitations from the point of view of the geophysics is that we don't see depth, so we're kind of limited in resolution. We recognize the PK at least on the upper region, and the HK has got some dipping sheets. So there's some obvious limitations, but here's where, okay, so we've kind of gone as far as we can go with the geophysics, but the question now is, okay, what if a couple of drill holes were available? So if you could do a geologic log that would have identified some rock units, provide some structural constraints, and then also use those same logs or same holes for geophysical logging and put bound constraints on it, you can see that from the geophysical model where we've got a number of different units that have been, these things look different, right, geophysically. So just spotting one here, and one here, would have just immensely cleaned things up and also provided some constraints, and I think would have made it cost effective. We're trying to figure out how to actually really kind of get these ideas into the hands of geologists who are doing this, and try to get them to have a little bit more respect for what might be coming from geophysics in this. And maybe it's a good idea to spend some more time working on this. That's basically it. Thanks. I really want to show that we're very proud of that work. Honestly, we've been working on this stuff for 3 or 4 years. We just published 3 papers in geophysics on interpretation, and I think it's one of the, one of the most sophisticated kind of serious analysis, especially airborne geophysics for kimberlites. Okey-dokey. So any questions?
That blue new mythology you suggest, are you getting much traction?
What's this?
You have a new lithology that you're suggesting on the edge, which is you color it blue.
Oh.
It didn't appear on the dribble.
Yeah, so here's where classification things become complicated, right? Because you have, let's suppose you've got some low susceptibility and you've got some high susceptibility, right? So in one region you got, kind of, I mean, it's still susceptible, but it's lower. And then the other place you've got some big high susceptibility. Well, eventually the high susceptibility has to go to low. I mean, it has to go to 0. So there's going to be some point in there where, like, oh, I'm ending up with the same, susceptibilities that I created over here. So, yeah, this is your first stab at this, but there's a lot more clearly that.
No, I mean, sometimes it's interesting because there's responses sometimes that are physical like that probably can hint to things that weren't picked up in the geologists. I mean, that's why I'm asking. I'm suggesting, hey, is our geologist saying, okay, there is actually a basis change or something there that we haven't picked up. This is just curious.
Yeah, I don't know. We are. I think there's room for one more paper here with respect to collecting the physical property measurements of these various units. One of the challenges is this pyroclastic stuff. It's really crumbly, right? And so you go to wet it up, and all you've got is a bunch of sand at the bottom. So it's tough to really make a measurement. Okay, well, I suggest then let's go ahead and have a coffee. I'm not sure, are they going to provide coffee or? And then we'll come back and let's. How many people are prepared to talk? Perfect. Okay. Do you guys have stuff on little thumb drives or something? Because we could load them onto the. We could load them on the computer while we're just having coffee. And also, for people who are presenting, would you mind if we posted your slides on our blog website? And also, if we'd like to record you as you're doing things. If you don't want that, we don't have to. They're so shy, aren't they? You can let us go. Okay, let's do coffee. Enough of this stuff.
Yeah, my role for next year.
Oh, I was actually talking about the yeah, but on the ground side of things, there's always
If we can take the data and see the chart.
that's got to be, and those reflect like just to steal some more of the gap.
So basically, I guess,
You know, we have the GAB water system there. And that's what that.
Yeah.
Like 200 million people. Wow. And I think that's just so we can see.
I don't. I meant to catch up with you yesterday and talk a little bit about something. So it's
and you just sign a term. You actually have to and that's not straightforward. It's already a honest problem. So you have to. So what?
No, okay. We're just looking at simple gravity to start with, so might get to the geometry.
So it just
Something similar to me.
So you're going to do teaching surveys.
that's right.
That's good for me. I'm gonna show the new way.
Yeah, because what happened is the reason the license come up was that
And then you're gonna have space,
we
so
were
you
hoping
know
that we
how
have
to
the
apply
coordinate
a phase shift and that.
sequence so we can like benchmark, but we still tested that one is not working yet, so we're still in the process of
So then
getting
what we
it,
suggested is
working where unfortunately I didn't really know the results, preliminary results that we thought we had to just hook up with by emails.
Control target, you know what's asking.
So what was your particular issue?
Yeah, well, one of the things we Ross and I were sure about was how to
So
deal with
that's what.
regional geography correlation. Yes, really with that large regional data. Sometimes
Where we are, what it's doing.
we wanted to know what was the best way to use regional data in a particular anomalies. What would be different ways of doing it, just not
Oh, good.
try everything.
Oh,
And the
Okay, mine was an ice survey.
One of those things.
With a humming bird?
Kind of problem specific.
Yes,
But we thought it was an
exactly.
environment, you know, we thought it was just a class.
But it
That's a long
is.
time ago.
We had an example of.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
The backing point.
And then they.
So you can have a look.
was going to be at Bristol.
He was meant to come here, but the reason he didn't come, we were looking for some data from here that he had to QC, and it was like, they needed it ASAP, and so we had to cancel this trip. He was meant to come.
Oh, but he might be.
Maybe, it's a maybe.
I love it.
We found out the data didn't actually come. But then he had already cancelled. But so it might come when he's around to go to we don't know.
So are you guys
No, we just on grabs now. So me attending this course is actually very close to speed with Ian because I haven't been exposed to it. And I work with Dave in this. He does
Okay. Well, I guess from the perspective of regional
yeah, that's right. We can communicate to the other as well. Now, is there any information? If we got Lindsay, is there anything that something or is it
No, there's well, yeah, the stuff is, I mean, there's stuff there, and there's, we're actually just building it.
Yeah, because I was talking to Lindsay yesterday, we were talking about this idea of having open source code. And I think it's out there because it's not like to reinvent the way we design something.
Exactly.
You can go, you know.
And the other thing is that, as people are working on pushing the envelope as far as what the application program is.
Yeah.
Any troubles or knowledge,
Yeah.
it makes for more of a conversation.
That's right.
Basis, right? So it's not only, get a code.
Oh, yeah, of course.
It's
Yeah.
really more, making sure that the codes are applicable for
Addresses
the kind of
everything.
problems that you're dealing with. And also the issues that you're finding, they're kind of non-standard, there's other things that are happening, so maybe other people can learn from them too. So in that sense, trying to work code towards
That's
an
an
open source.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I'm on. Yeah. Anyway, I think.
Especially when we're getting back and forth.
So, do you notice there's coffee around here?
Yeah, you go look out the building and then turn right and then go up towards that modern building apparently, and that's where you go. There's a coffee shop there.
Yes.
You know where we walk through? Take back there. Yeah, you know, just where we walk through the one.
Oh, let's go. So that's where moving this. Are you working on stochastic versions or ensemble versions or just showing versions?
So I haven't done much in terms of stochastic. One of the things I started to work on, it's about some of where you actually expect sensitivity. Yeah, so one of the versions that we do is big enough, heavy enough version that you don't want to transfer out to figure out.
Yeah.
So since the freeze not bad, I do that. Also, using things like the investigation, writing out areas of the model, at least we can sort of say.
This is where we really need to look at.
Yeah, and I guess to a lot of stuff, we also like targeted hypothesis testing. So if you see an anomaly, can we remove this and then force the version to sort of not put anything there, and if it's okay with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we will put it that way, because then, I mean, it's in a lot of our cases, it's not necessarily like uncertainty about whole models that matters, it's where we a decision somewhere. And so it was just that sort of all of it. So, yeah. Good. So the bird makes the USGS. It's doing a lot of so he might be an interesting person to look at.
Yeah. What's it?
Bird makes BRK. Yeah, these are the USGS.
Yeah, so almost kind of just that.
It's a student.
Oh,
So usually we do that EM inversion. How long does that take? Is it like a long time to do the inversion?
oh, it's already in my size of your problem. I'm looking at right now more so the single source conversions, and so that's a little like you're in direction. They're more in the end version, that's bigger. So it will be stable. Yes.
Right.
How many frequencies?
Yeah, that's all. That's something about this very short inversion between or just all and probably what we do the inversion here. The one thing I'm really worried is the long time. Which I don't understand how long the inversion is.
I mean, that's something to play around with. There's a lot of questions on how you couple the inversions.
You just filter engineering so it fits.
Well, that's not too bad to do. It's much like the physical properties of the stuff and translate.
I mentioned that that's bigger physical value.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I go connectivity and like.
Yeah, and how strongly you want to enforce that.
Yeah.
Because you can sort of enforce it directly by saying, I mean, for one parameter, but then enforce back to your directions laws. And that is a fairly harsh constraint. What that is, I think is interesting, what TPC here is everything is inverted independently, and then we assess from that side of things. Okay, what do we have in common? What kind of interpretation make from that? I mean, it would be an interesting thing to follow up and look at things like sharper constraints. Once you've got a handle on, where you think things are wrong, what things you think defines a single rock unit.
And it's because that's where we'll find it is going as well. Every system going the system structure of the actual system from the and more from the chemistry away from your ground of thought.
Yeah.
And do they all want the same thing or broader than trying to move together?
Yeah. One of the things that I also think is cool, Josh has he's been doing some stuff with clustering as a regularization on energy conversions. So basically, you start out with your version, and then you basically regularize towards processes. So you basically say, okay, I'm seeing correlations in these two physical properties hormones. So that's a really interesting approach.
Get my head around this. I'll be playing around with clustering out these kind of things. It's another tough part in itself.
Yeah.
So what are you guys going to talk about?
Basically, we looked at that deeper.
Oh, yeah.
But some supervisor things at PhD and now it's we're trying to find the case. And I've got an area in the territory and there's a reason here, but just want to get some feedback later. There's actually something that we can get from that room from that existing media. That's one of the issues I'm putting. geophysical ID and just
Well, sorry, I'll move that.
something that's been done for exploration and yeah, we get more out of that. But that's good.
I think that's perfect.
It's increasing in time. I know we're in Australia, especially with this loaded. You're working in scenario, everything to do with it.
First off, you're on it. We're all figured. Yeah, so all of the data and the code that we actually run are completely. So should you were to find all of them. Yeah, I would like to actually announce that the version provided. So it's. It just came out very good.
Oh,
good. Excellent. May or may not remember this.
Oh,
But yeah, we're looking forward to get the
some more information about that.
I'll bet we just have also. You have a lot of students, and so, yeah, so there's some examples.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Well, if you're interested,
Extra things, some software.
Google form. So if you just want to Google Forms, you're most welcome to join, and this is where we're coming along. Because that also lets us really tap into. That's not necessarily solutions. Yeah. And so, if you are interested in, well, if you're interested in programming, they're busy guys. I would like to chat and show you
Sort of make yourself
how that would work, where.
Mission University.
Yeah. Sorry, are these, and we do all of that meeting.
They are, all of the ones.
So, you don't need to watch them, but if you do want to catch up with them, hear the
Broadband
conversation.
tend to be project based for a while. Most units,
I think you need to make a request so that I'll see it, and then I will add it. Yeah.
we think this is Rolls Royce. You flag it out. Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, as an example, so I can personally.
But that's GA, isn't it?
John, did you bring it?
No, I was just some coffee, just in case you want some coffee. If you want to tomorrow, just give me a call. I'm quite happy to take you around.
Oh, okay.
If you want to get yourself, that's fine too.
Yeah, we're trying to see, we're supposed to do. We'll find out.
Yeah, it must be wearing doing all of this all the time.
Yeah, I think we're probably gonna get pretty tired, but this is a good audience.
Well, it's really interesting in terms of the IP. You do need the EM to get it right.
Yeah.
But
you know, you can go, it's a little easier to go along on the ground source. You have an approximation, probably approximation. On the inductive source, it's pretty easy to put in. But, you know, early days, and
On progress.
so were you going to talk to them, right?
Nope.
You're not?
No, Dave's doing it. He's busy preparing. But I did, I dug out some decays that show both positive and negative EM effects. It's on the gradient, so I'll send that to you.
Oh, okay.
Because it shows just 8 dipoles,
Yeah.
and you get really strong negative, really strong positive, really strong positive, really strong negative as you go across the dipoles. And you see that quite often. You get the positive
And do you
on one
have
side.
an explanation for what's going
Well,
on?
the only thing I can think of is that there's a strong vertical conductor. And then on one side, you're getting the currents going one way, and on the other side, you're going the other way.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. So let's.
And certainly, the other way is that you get a clay pan. And as you come to the clay pan, you get stronger and stronger negatives at early time until you go over the clay pan and it's all negative. You go off the clay pan and it goes the other way. So you get the two,
this
so
sounds,
flat line or vertical.
yeah, so this sounds good. So it'd be worthwhile to propagate.
I can show you the pictures.
Yeah. And then we'll take. Let's see if there's understand, right? Because I think that's the most interesting part. You get data and you kind of scratch your head over it, like, what's going on here?
Well, I get a lot of inquiries from people that say, we've collected this IP survey, we've got this really, really strong chargeable diagonal. I think, oh, this is really exciting. I say, well, do you have a strong negative in the next diagonal? And they say, oh, yeah. We ignored that bit.
Yeah.
They say, well, it's probably
It's
not
called
chargeable.
bias reading.
Yeah. So, but yeah, they know enough to say, well, you're not getting a symmetric, a V shape anomaly. We've only got one side of it. So what does that mean? Does it mean we've got something chargeable? So, probably not.
Oh, okay, so let's follow this up. Okay, can I get people to have a chair? Actually, was there a washroom?
Down the first stairs and out the back.
I'll say, number 5.
We'll get things going here. Okay, so we've got 4.
I think the cooling's
It sort of adjusted to even.
We have 4 talks that are loaded on. You wanna come over, Lindsay?
Are we starting?
Yeah. Oh, you start. Or so there's 4. Oh, okay. Oh, that was great. Graham?
With that EM effect on, you just sort of inverting them both way in and just
Well, I guess that's what we were trying.
give it a go.
So have you, I mean, the ideas of doing this have been around for a long time.
Yeah, software, I guess, is part of the problem.
Then, if I can
Well, only if you have negative EM, you can you can basically do a quick model of that to take off the negative part of the decay to leave you with the IP component. So because in negatives, pretty easy to identify from the early time. So that lets you take out the damage.
So you do that by sitting kind of like cold representation?
Yes. And that works pretty well because the trouble with the negative ion is it suppresses the chanceability of the model that is there because it does go positive late times.
Yeah.
But it can't do it for positive ion. Positive ion is very difficult to decouple from the positive one.
Was there somebody saying? All right, so we'll get going here with talks from everybody. This is meant to be informal, so we'd love to hear what you're up to, questions that you have, things you're interested in exploring further. If you would prefer not to be filmed, just let me know, and I can shut that off. We might ask you to go last. That'll just be easier on our end. But if you are, that would be great. It's very helpful for us to regroup and remember what we saw and where we were connecting with everybody. And so,
well, the other thing is we're also very happy to just let the camera go, and if you do not want it posted, it's still fine for our eyes, then that would be great, because otherwise get a lot of material and then at some point you just can't figure out what did he say or what did that slide refer to. So it is kind of nice for us to have a verbal history, but just let us know, like, no, I don't want you to post that, and then we're fine.
Yeah, absolutely. So who would like to go first? Any volunteers? Come on up. Very nice. And then, Doug, do you have your clicker?
Yeah, it should be right there. 3. So that's the, what's the one? Yeah.
So you can either use that, or you can.
Here's a good, so use this for this pointing, and then this should back and forth. Yeah, that's good to go.
Hi everyone, I'm James. So I'm just going to present what I've been doing in relation to geophysics. I have a background in hydrogeology, but I've been working with David Allen, who was the company Groundwater Imaging, and he specializes in geophysics application in various water stuff, like to investigate seepage along canals and in reservoirs or dams, soil moisture mapping, alluvial mapping for mining approvals, and siting water bores. So one of the equipment that is used is it's called HABI, Hydroelectrical Resistivity and Bathymetric Image. It's got a towed electrode which are strategically placed and measures resistivity data underneath the water channels. So we've been doing a lot of work with Murray irrigation and Goulburn Murray in Victoria. So that just does the electrical resistivity. Another equipment is the AgTech. It was developed mainly for agricultural purposes to explore for groundwater, but we recently used it to map out alluvium in northern Brisbane for Pembroke mine. They are about to develop a mine, so they are supposed to map out alluvium along Isaac River. And that's what we used. It's got a loop about 6 meters loop, transmitting loop, and a receiving loop in there. So we just throw it along the Land Rover, and it acquires the conductivity and resistivity data. With the geoelectric, that's how we deploy the equipment, either by throwing it along, or we throw it with a Land Rover, with a boom attached on the side, and just continuous acquisition of data. And we use a boat depending on the conditions, so it's a very effective and quick way of collecting data. So that's the job that we did in Queensland, just driving along and collecting data of the AgTem, which is a time domain electromagnetic system. That's a EM31 system that we used for Mare irrigation survey. Just put it on a quad bike and ride along and collect data.
Well, excuse me, what was the transmitter receiver in the first one you showed in the one that you're towing in the,
This one?
in the water? No, in the, what is it, Herbie or something?
This
Yeah,
one?
that guy there.
Yeah.
What's in
So that's what's in there is a resistivity meter and GPS, and so it tows it's got a electrode cable behind it, about maybe between 20 and 100 meters, depending on the depth that you want to acquire. And then you take resistivity data. And what comes out is something like this. So you can see, you can tell where the problem area is, like here. And they normally fix that with using plastic liners to prevent water loss under the ground.
So your dark colors are more resistant?
Yeah, the colors are clay, conducting.
Oh, dark is conductive.
Yeah. Do you mean, okay, dark,
No, it looks like your
the blue one?
stars,
Yeah, the blue one.
those are resistant.
That's resistive. Yeah. And that's the AgTem data that was acquired close to a river, and you could differentiate maybe the alluvium closer to the river. And that's it.
So if you go back to that previous picture where you said there was a problem, so you've got a inferred seepage.
Which one?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
So you've got, it's very resistive.
Yeah, so you have clay, and then maybe close to the surface you have maybe silt or.
And what is making it resistive that is connected with seepage?
They could be palliate channels along, maybe connecting maybe to another. Could be underneath channels.
Is that correlated at all with where you're losing water?
Yes.
So your overall goal is like on all of the waterways here, just to kind of drag this through, get some estimate of how that resistivity is changing.
Yes,
and then
that's
try to
right,
make
yes.
some inferences.
Yes. Because seepage is one of the biggest water losses with irrigation channels.
Yeah.
So they're just trying to find out how they can minimize seepage, and they need to locate the problem areas. And that's the most effective way they can do it.
So was the ground surrounding this region, it was really wet or something, so you could tell it was seeping from there, or it's just seeping down? And
Yeah,
you
it's
can't
seeping
see
down
anything?
under the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see. And then if you find them, then you go back and you put you said a clay
clay
layer or
yeah,
a
clay
vinyl
lining or
layer or
plastic
something.
lining.
depths are you looking at? What's the view?
It's really shallow, maybe about 6 meters.
So is this equipment all built in Australia? It's all
Yes.
local stuff?
Yeah, it's built in Australia. Okay.
Great, any volunteers to go next?
You can start with the top one. So I've got a couple of sources also.
Perfect. So you can either use the mouse here, or you can use this guy.
Okay. Lovely. So I've just put a few slides. These are some slides I presented before, and I just put down a few things. First one, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Graham Heinsohn. I'm Professor of Geophysics here at the University of Adelaide. And one of the big projects we're working on at the moment is OzLab. So for those of you who may not have seen OzLab, the idea is to collect long period magnetotelluric data across the whole of Australia. About 3,000 sites. We're collecting them at half-degree sort of orientation in a grid, so there's roughly about 50 kilometres between sites. We're working very much with state and federal geological surveys, and it's pre-competitive data in the sense that it provides sort of maps and products about the Australian continent, its geological history, its evolution, and it leads very much into the mineral exploration space because of the link between deep sources of fluids, thermal changes, and the placement of mineral systems near the surface. So we started about 2013, and it's about a 10-year program. It's probably about a $15 million project, and it links with an industry sort of driven initiative called Uncover. And Uncover is really just about, the final report's being produced in about a week's time. But the concept is minerals are sort of in the middle, you know, it's a small target, very difficult to find, particularly in the Australian context where you've got large sediments and very sort of thick cover over many areas, perhaps 80% of the country. But what you should do instead is look for either the source, so the fluid delivery system at the bottom, the mantle, the lower crustal fluxes, or you look up to the top and you look at the chemical dispersion, the footprint through the cover sequence. So which is much larger targets to aim for. So with MT, we're looking at the bottom part, that fluid delivery system. And where we're at the moment is we've been collecting data, and the state of Victoria has all been covered, the state of Tasmania has been done. Pretty much all of South Australia has been completed. We're just in the final phase of that program. We'll be finished around about October this year. New South Wales is being done at the moment, and that will be a 3 or 4 year program. And then Geoscience Australia particularly are doing the whole of the region north of the Tropic of Capricorn. So it's about 1,100 sites. Each site has long period MT instruments left out for 3 weeks at a time, and records really large and long periods of electromagnetic induction. So a few images just showing induction arrows. It's one product of the MT data set. The induction arrows, in a nutshell, point between resistors to conductors. The black arrows are the in phase, the white are out of phase. But what they show is really quite large scale patterns of induction. And I've plotted these on top of gravity maps. There's another one here of some bits of South Australia. This is a famous area called the Stewart Shelf that's highlighted over here. It's where Olympic Dam is situated. And what these induction arrows show is really large patterns of big changes in crustal electrical conductivity. Whereas when you go on the ground, there's nothing there. It's flat. It's covered by hundreds of meters of sediment. So the question is, where's the next big Olympic Dam deposit? Can we find some signature? Let's go through that one. Just one of the outputs. So this is work that one of these, my former PhD student, now at the Geological Survey, Kate, has been working on. It's an area called the Kernamona. It hosts the Broken Hill deposit. And what Kate's been doing is doing three-dimensional inversions to sort of slice down through the earth. The reds are conductors, the blues are resistors. It's a sort of complex pattern, but it's gained a lot of interest from mineral explorers because what they're looking for, big red areas, show some areas that is conducting the seawater, maybe 10 kilometers thick of 1 ohm meter. Incredible conductances. The question is, well, we don't know what causes them, but there must be an imprint of a thermal and fluid process. So the question is, how does that drive perhaps mineral systems up towards the surface? So we're kind of investigating, and the next phase of OSLAM is really to infill in the areas of importance. The challenges, though, are really trying to interpret the data. So many of our inversions are big, smooth inversions. They produce big, smooth, blobby conductivity models. We show them to the geologists. The geologists say, what does that blob mean? Can I drill there or over there? And we really are challenged, I think, by trying to interpret the data in a geological fashion. We're thinking about how do we integrate it with gravity, how do we integrate it with ambient noise tomography and the elastic properties of the crust. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. But there's some real challenges to get good geological products out. So I think that was probably what I was going to show you. This is a sort of typical example of this is actually North America, but very sort of typical kind of conductivity models coming out of these 3D inversion schemes. They have a high degree of complexity. Electromagnetically, we know that we don't have that level of resolution. Intrinsically, we can't pick out small, fine-scale features like this, but also geologically, it's very difficult to think that 50 kilometers down, why do we have bands of 1 ohm meter and 100 ohm meters? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's our challenge at the moment. We're collecting a lot of data, but we're not putting a lot of effort in, or not comparable effort in the interpretation. Shall I go to the other woman?
So what kinds of scenarios do you envision to interact with geologists and the geologic information and converting that to petrophysical properties? I mean, how do you see a path forward that looks like it might work here?
I think one of the things we can do is we can just add in more constraints. We know where the oceans are, so that's an easy bit of information. We actually got some pretty good sedimentary thickness maps down to Proterozoic basement, so we can put that in as some reasonable porosity, conductivity, depth arrangements. My sense is that pretty much most of the conductivity variations we're seeing are in the lower crust, so somewhere between about 10 kilometers and about 40 kilometers. I'm not sure more slides on that, but that's where all the action is. That's the sort of the big thermal footprint. That's the metamorphic change that's released the fluids, that's driven them upwards. We see often a very high conductance at about 10 kilometers down that really reflects potentially a sort of, even in a very simple sense, a pooling of fluids or some kind of rheological boundary. And then in certain areas, we see very strong little connections up to the surface. And one slide I haven't got here is that at Olympic Dam, we see a very strong connection between a large lower crustal conductor and the mineral systems, not only at Olympic Dam, but some of the smaller systems as well. So the question is, can we pick up from the bottom to the top in a way that makes geological sense? And I think there's a combination of both a smooth inversion to say, what does the data tell us in a raw sense? How much information can it support? But secondly, can we then ask questions of those data, either in a forward modeling, in a kind of forward iterative models in a sense, trying to sort of pose questions and test data And as much actually find models that don't work as what models that do work, that it's easy. We can sometimes pose questions and say, what if it's conducting here and it's not? Because we cannot support the data, then we can rule out that. We can't necessarily rule in every scenario. But we're finding the modeling is challenging in the sense that the 3D inversions we're running on the national computer infrastructure in Canberra, the largest supercomputer, it still takes forever to get a model out, runs for 3 weeks, produces a model, and we say, what does that mean? And it's not, we're approaching the problem from a brute force point of view rather than a kind of scientific questioning point of view. But it's, the aim eventually is to produce a full model of Australia, and individually what we're doing is sort of breaking the continent into cratons and geological areas that make some sense.
Are you converting in spherical coordinates then here, or do you need to?
No, I mean, it's all in rectangular.
And then what sort of sizes are you talking about when you're talking?
So at the moment, let's just go back to this figure here. So the model that Kate was running was something like 400 or 500 kilometers by, so of the order of perhaps 1,000 kilometers by 1,000 kilometers with 10, 20 kilometer space grids. And, so it's relatively coarse.
And yes, what does that make for size of cells or number of cells that you've got?
150 by 150 sort of type scenarios, and maybe 30 layers. It's a little bit easier to do the interior sort of continent ones because you don't have to reel in the ocean, which you've got a very sharp boundary in, which means you need that sort of discretization to capture that very sharp change. So in the sort of continental interior, and the continental shelf is quite a long way off from the coastline here, so to a large extent, and there's ways of we tested bigger models to smaller models, but we're limited by computational size. But there's also a sense that perhaps we're not approaching the problem from a good scientific process, we're just approaching it from the largest computer we can find with the biggest code we can run.
And then what do you do for boundary conditions?
Well, this is ModEM, which is Gary Egbert's code. So essentially it's extending boundaries off it's away and it's approaching a two-dimensional scenario on the edges.
So you put in two-dimensional structure on both north, south, and east, west?
Well, I guess it starts from half space or some kind of guided sort of coin rates, but I guess at the boundaries, essentially it's the two-dimensional boundary conditions.
It was just interesting about the difference between the brute force and the scientific approach. Do you have a strategy to figure, like, do you know what you're looking for in those inversions, or is it just looking at the map and saying, here's something I didn't expect? Do you have a strategy to?
Well, I think it's thinking through what we're trying to look at. And my sense is, we're solving for the entire model space with everything unconstrained by and large. But we actually, we know the sediments. In most areas, the upper crust, particularly on that 50-kilometer spacing, is quite resistive overall. The mantle should be fairly resistive, and if there is change, should be over wavelengths of thousands of kilometers, because it's more thermal, compositional, but it's not going to have very sharp changes. So I think what we need to do is to actually focus all that model space down to mostly the lower crust, because that's actually what the mineral explorers are most interested in. What we find, for example, the Stewart Shelf is you line up all the big mineral deposits, they all line on the edge of the big lower crustal conductors. So, in a geological sense, it looks like an instability, a boundary between crustal compositions, thermal histories, this sort of weak point, and perhaps there's essentially a fluid flux upwards. at that sort of weaker point, but we can kind of line them all up. We similarly see that in the Conamona and up into Mount Isa as well.
Is there topography that you need to worry about? It looks like there's mountains there.
A little bit. It's not too bad for South Australia. We're working with one of our colleagues in Tasmania at the moment, and the issue there is that on a 50-kilometre spacing, one site's on the top of the mountain, the next one's down in a deep valley, and the next one's at the coast. And the change in MT response is huge between sites. There's an aliasing problem. Here, particularly for the Gawler Craton, it's flat. Thanks.
Are people still worried about doing various corrections to the data, for static shift in that, or are they just now trying to model it out?
Basically trying to model it, but it's hard when the data start at about 4 or 5 seconds period and then go upwards, because there's a whole heap of things in the crust at the higher frequencies that you don't know what's there, but have a sensitive, the data is sensitive to them but not resolving. And so there's a bit of ad hoc variation, sometimes a bit of on the fly static shift, a bit of try it and see. I think one of the things we've been trying to think about is the induction errors, because the magnetics is so regional and it integrated all the effects. It produces a much simpler story and invert the or the induction errors first to give you a regional conductance map and that much depth information, and then use that as the framework for a full MT inversion. And the MT is often, because the E field is so localized and so influenced by things like local topography, sometimes you're not quite sure whether one site and the next site really have, they're looking deeply at the same Earth, but shallowly quite different influence.
Do you have airborne surveys over bits and pieces of that you can start to build a reference model?
So absolutely, actually, for the Frome, which is where it says Conamona, so pretty much in the middle of the black square, is the largest airborne EM survey in the planet. Is that right? I think.
Yes.
Very large.
I think it's big, but it's
And
it's a different one.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's limited because some of the sedimentary cover there is 400 or 500 meters or more thick. So the airborne doesn't give you basement, but
No, but it'll
it gives you that surface.
pin down your top reference, which is very important for your MT.
And it'd be good to see if we could use, as a sort of ad hoc static shift indicator, just cover sequence. Actually, Ben at Max doing this for his honours. Can you get a rough indication of what the static effect might be just on the fact that the cover thins here and thickens there?
Then we might we just did some points and stuff in ISA.
Yep.
And so we're hoping to work on the same sort of problems there. So we might be able to sort of what we can nut out there might be able to help you in a moment. I can show that in a second.
Do you have one while I'm up here? Driving in Mac. It's like speed dance. I don't know.
Oh, because of multi-loop. That's the only reason why you had to match the Yeah.
All right. While I have the floor, just one of the other things we have been doing in our group, and I'll say we, my role becomes increasingly diminished over the years as my great PhD and postdocs sort of do all the hard work. So there's some of the group there. We did some work a few years ago thinking, particularly with the geothermal sector. And the idea was basically, from an engineered point of view, there's so much of the resource development that moves fluids, and it either moves it out of the ground, things like coal seam gas or coal bed methane, or it moves it into the ground for things like fracking, hydraulic stimulation. And so you've actually got an engineered system where you know a lot about the constraints. You know what time, how much fluid, what the conductivity of that fluid is, where you've injected it, how much has come out. And you've often got bore logs, so you've got lots of information around that particular place. So the question which we work with industry about is really permeability. It's what can we tell from electrical sense in terms of permeability to aid in sort of unconventional resources. And we slightly compare ourselves against microseismics, because microseismics has been fantastically successful, particularly in North America, at monitoring kind of engineered energy resource development. And of course, it's a highly evolved, highly successful group. And the time I put this slide together, we had done 5 projects versus 25,000 microseismics had done. We concentrated on natural source, and the idea with that is that a lot of the resource developments, we say coal bed methane, was over days and weeks and months. And having a transmitter-based EM system, even though you've got the resolution, you've got the, you can really put your signal in, there's a logistic of actually having transmitters going, and people and safety and everything else, whereas the passive receivers are just there all the time. So we're mostly concentrating on electric fields because we could sort of cover an area with E fields, maybe a few B fields in certain places, to give you a proxy MT type response, or at least an coupled transfer function, and a view of really monitoring over time changes in apparent resistivity in a sort of vector sense. And we did this initially with Paralana, which is a geothermal system. This is an enhanced geothermal system, so these are deep granites underneath many kilometers of sediment. The concept is basically high thermal gradients. Sediments have low thermal conductivity, and therefore you get high temperatures at relatively shallow depths. And if you frack them, hydraulic stimulation, you can generate enough permeability that you can pump water down, in this case about 3 kilometers, heat it up, and you get vast amounts of energy out. So this was a project which took place about 4 or 5 years ago. And we sort of covered the area with MT at various stages. The little inset map is actually, the center point is the well, the borehole, for stimulation. It's a cross section on the right. The little triangles are the MT sites. The little grey dots are the microseismic cloud from that stimulation. So there's a sort of roughly northwest sort of orientation of the stimulation. We did a whole lot of MT in there, and what we're looking at the top left is phase tensor residuals. Now, the way to think about these is that you collect data, it's mostly one-dimensional, it's very sedimentary, it's kind of kilometers thick. And then over time, because you've increased the hydraulic conductivity in one direction, the prevalent sort of stress fields, you connect water up much better and you change the resistivity a little bit in one direction. And therefore, when you look at the phase tensor, it's changed, it's no longer a circle, it's a little bit elliptical. You take the difference between them, and the difference gives you some measure of orientational change. So these are all the sites around the wellbore, pretty much the same orientation as the microseismic array. The plots on the right-hand side are a sort of period versus change in the phase tensors. And we saw, quite a significant and fairly consistent pattern that sort of matched what we saw with microseismics, but in a way it was a very cheap project because we're only putting out MT sensors here.
Can you just sort of elaborate a little bit? I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah.
100% like what you're actually.
Yes, sorry. So what I've done here, so if you took one empty response. In a reasonably one-dimensional environment, your phase tensor will be a circle because there's no preferred orientation for conductivity. If you've hydraulically fractured the rock, in principle, you're going to increase the fluid and the hydraulic permeability in one direction, preferably to another, and therefore you've got a slightly more anisotropic subsurface resistivity. So your phase tensor is slightly different in shape, and if you took the one circle from another, or one phase pre versus post pumping.
So when you say you're, maybe it's actually the term phase tensor, I'm not 100% sure. What exactly do you mean by that?
The phase tensor is basically the impedance phase, and it's the measure that I think the Grant Caldwell originally brought out, which was sort of independent of the amplitudes of the apparent resistivity. So it got around some of the issues of static shift. So the idea was that it really looked at essentially differences in modal phase, and you could represent it as a circle or an ellipse, depending on whether the phase had sort of a difference between the modes, or whether it was the same, it would be the same in all directions and plot as a circle. So it's, I guess, possibly a simple way to think about it, it's a measure of the change in the EM response as measured by the phase. And the more elongated it is, the more it's changed in that direction. If it hadn't changed at all, it would be basically a point. What we've got here is period down the left-hand side. We've got site spacing from east to west. And because we're looking at an engineered change at about 300 kilometers, we only start to see an effect at a period of about 1 second and longer.
And when you say predicted, you've actually got a three-dimensional model that you're looking at?
Well, this was the challenge. It was one of these cases where we could see an observational evidence for change in the sense that the EM response to the surface had changed. But because of, we're still trying to work out the best way of, I guess it's a small change, and therefore inverting it for the structure, the non-uniqueness of that model was quite difficult to pin down to a certain level. What we're trying to do is sort of restrict the use of a prior model, restrict the change to about 3 kilometers, and then invert it just for a small zone. We didn't have enough data for a true 3D inversion. We were doing it on sort of two-dimensional lines. That's really where we had the data density. And it didn't work in the sense that the change was a little bit longer period than we were expecting. So we could never quite get the model out. So we were in a situation of being able to observe a change, but not really being able to quantify it in terms of a model space. The other thing which we've struggled with is that if you look at the amount of fluid that was actually injected, the total conductance of that fluid is a relatively small extra amount in the Earth. I mean, it was a trivial amount. But the change we see implies a much bigger volume of Earth change. And the only way we could really interpret that was that the hydraulic fracturing, the big effect is not so much the fluid actually injected, it's the opening of the hydraulic conductivity within the Earth, connecting already in situ pore fluids, which are already, we know, are quite saline. So we couldn't quantify. I mean, when we talk to geologists, they said, well, you'd never be able to see this amount of fluid. We're injecting it into a single fracture. How would you ever spot that? And we said, well, we can't spot that level of detail, but what we can do is we actually seem to be sensing a much bigger volume.
What ballpark volume of water?
It was somewhere between 3 and 10 million litres injected, which, in Olympic swimming pool times is about 4 or 5 swimming pools. It's a trivial amount. It's a lot of water. It's 4 kilometres down. It's tiny.
Was it saline water that you?
Yeah. So we followed it up a little bit. This was coal seam gas. This was in Queensland. The length of line, 2.5 kilometres. The W's are wells. Drilling down maybe about 800 metres, intersecting very small coal seams at about 2 or 3, 400, 500 metres. And what's called depressurization. You pump out water, and basically as you reduce the pressure in that aquifer, you release gas from the coal cleats. The challenge for the coal seam gas industry is that of those wells, they're about 300 or 400 metres apart. One will produce loads of gas, the next one will produce almost nothing, the next one will produce lots of water. There's no water, but the heterogeneity of the aquifers is so large. The sort of production of coal and the intersection of coal seams is so varied that they really have very little way of truly siting optimally the next location. And when they are producing, you don't know where the water is coming from. So just no volume coming out. So we monitored there. We had loads of problems with animals eating everything. So lots of lines, lost lots of instruments, but these two plots just show inversions from one line for 2 days prior to the pumping. What we've done is taken the difference, and most of the difference in change of the resistivity is sort of plus or minus 10%. So we kind of use that as our kind of threshold of essentially noise in the data mapped to noise in the earth. We then looked at post-production, and we then difference the post-production from the pre-production, and we get a figure on the right-hand side, which shows a much larger than 10% variation. And it's mostly in this, the coal measures seem at about 300 or 400 kilometers down, sorry, 300 or 400 meters down. The interesting thing from here is these two wells produced reasonable amounts of water. This one produced almost nothing. And you can sort of see that from the page. In fact, well 4 produced the most water, well 5 produced a bit. And what it sort of implies is that there's a heterogeneity of permeability that coming from one direction and another. This is a 2D, so it's kind of a bit of a fiction. It's not quite projected on that plane, but it does appear that the water was more coming from the west than the east that well. We've also done sort of time plots. So this is a period of about 3 months or so, 2 months, and really looked at the time change just from a 1D sense from one instrument. This was one near, so 112 was an instrument which was some distance away from one of the pumping wells. 105 was the well pumped, or nearest the one which produced the most. The blue line is the water production, and you can see that, with time, that's where you get the resistivity change. So these are small resistivities. They go from 2 to 4 ohm meters, blue to red scale. So it's all conducting basically. It's marginal science, but we think there's an inkling of it's truth in it. So this is, we think it's quite an interesting idea. We find it's quite difficult to model. One of the problems we're trying to do is to use the pre-production models as a priori and step them forward. But the danger there is you kind of step the noise forward as well, the model uncertainty. So we needed a way of forward and backwards smoothing, and we kind of halved it a bit. It was worked in. I'm not sure we really got the algorithm right, but the advantage here is that these are very low-cost instruments. We were looking at the next generation of being able to remotely telemeter data each day, so you could basically watch change in the Earth at time. And you can put out lots of instruments, and you only need to put out mostly E field, because the B field really doesn't change very much. So lots and lots of kind of cables. We had the cables on the ground. It's one of these projects where we got a phone call saying, right, we're ready to go tomorrow. So everything went out, but it was very quick to put out, proper burying of electrode lines. So that's the other kind of work we're doing. We've done a bit with shale gas. And we've made some progress with it, but we've also run up against the fact that the oil industry has lost a bit of shine in the last year or two, and they don't have kind of research and development sort of projects and programs at the moment, but we'll keep that space open.
Yeah, this how deep are the coal seam gas?
They're looking at, it's about 400 meters or so. So we're kind of in the AMT kind of bandwidth. We were sampling at 1,000 hertz. It's probably, if we could have sampled higher, that would have been better. But in such a conducting environment, you get a reasonable bandwidth from just the natural fields, and of course. So time domain EM would have worked quite well as well, but it wouldn't have given you that necessarily the vector sort of orientation.
It's been the last 3 years trying to model how that depressurization at depth moves through the system to the shallow aquifers. Big frustration for me is that there's no data out there to calibrate against for that. Is this something that has potential to monitor even after production to see how that system changes?
Yep. I guess certain areas you've got a number of wells so you can monitor one's observation for another. One of the other questions we were interested here, and I guess from the regulatory point of view, is the overlying sandstone unit. The question was, is there a hydraulic connection when we see a change? And with the usual EM blurriness, we really didn't see a lot of change actually in anything above that coal measure layer. And we also saw the bulk of production coming from the the upper coal measures rather than the coal measures down there, which sort of matched the companies. The companies were very secretive about their information. Why would that be? And so we're kind of interested in the point of view of both the environment and social kind of monitoring, and an economic sort of point of view in the sense of siting of wells.
So this is it usually saline water that they're pulling out of here?
Yeah, it can be incredibly saline. One of the questions as well is some of the companies produce so much water, and so some of the processes is to leave it to evaporate, but there's also, I'm not sure that's always allowed, and so there's questions of whether you re-pump it back down into much deeper aquifers. The question then is, a long-term monitoring of that deeper aquifer, and it's difficult to do. There's very little way of monitoring it other than the well itself, monitoring that's downhole.
So when you're, I'm looking at your red overprint. So the red is 2 meters, is it?
Yes, that's right.
And blue's 4. So, and then this is a difference between. Sorry, can you run by exactly what you're...
Actually, this is a smaller interval. So this is 350 meters to 650. So the pumping was over 400 to 700. The coal measures were in a smaller zone.
And then you'd expect that it's going to get more resistant with time, right?
That's what we would have expected, more resistant. But actually, we get seeing actually a bit more.
Yeah, that's what I was confused about. So you're pumping out saline water.
Yeah.
You're putting it in with, there's gas going in. And so you expect it to get more resistant, right?
We would certainly expect it to be more resistive, but what we got molecules actually became a little bit more conductive. The only sort of really way we could explain it is that as you start setting the gas evolving, the coal actually reduces a little bit. There's a slight increase in permeability. So there's a slightly better connection of fluids, slightly. But we didn't understand we didn't have a calibration to know why we were seeing a change in that direction. So it was sort of unexpected. We would have expected, as you're drawing more fluid in. Well, we're not sure, when you're starting to draw fluid out, where does the recharge come from to replace the fluids you're taking out? Do you just basically dry it out? Do you bring in more saline water from somewhere else, perhaps? I don't know. It's one of those observational things that we didn't really have an explanation. Similarly with the gas, the geothermal and shower gas. Sort of an observation that we couldn't really quite explain petrophysically other than in a general sense.
But those observations being made while you're pumping.
Yes, that's
fluid
right.
Is moving.
Yes.
Saline fluid.
Yes. I mean, what we lacked is, what we really wanted is just to repeat the whole experiment. But the company we worked with got taken over, and they got taken over, and then all the people we worked with got made redundant, and started all over again.
Is there any microseismic collector over this?
No, there wasn't. And for these areas, there isn't a lot of microseismic because it's so sort of soft. They had characterized it with lots of other geophysics, but they didn't tell us anything. Okay.
Thank you. So there's two more. Seriously, this one.
Yeah, the first two would have been done.
This one? This is the right one?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can use this will flex, and then if you want a laser pointer, this one.
And then you can use the keyboard if you want, but it's right
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Lee. I've been working at the state government for about 7 years, and my background is in groundwater. And I've recently started doing a PhD with Graham, looking at using geophysics to improve groundwater modeling. And I would like to use this opportunity to share with you how a groundwater person sees geophysics, and particularly EM, what problems we are facing in groundwater, and how geophysics may potentially be able to help us. And this is mostly my personal opinion, but this also includes insights I gained from chatting with academics in universities, consultants, and also my colleagues at the state government. And I'm aware that there are not many groundwater people in this room, so please let me to use a slide to explain why do we care about groundwater. So from a global perspective, groundwater is important because it accounts for 96% of all the fresh water on the planet. And it is also very important for South Australia. For instance, many of you may have been to Port Lincoln on the Eyre Peninsula. And groundwater is important for water supply. It supplies more than 90% of water supply to the whole Eyre Peninsula. And further north, groundwater management is also very important for mining, very often because the ore is below the groundwater level. And groundwater needs to be pumped up first before mining can occur. And in the Adelaide Plains, groundwater is used intensively for agricultural irrigation. And in the southeast, groundwater is important for forestry. So it supports a lot of blue gum plantations in the southeast. And in the River Murray area, where one of our case studies yesterday about the Boppanon floodplain also belongs to this River Murray area, In this area, groundwater is very salty, even saltier than seawater in some areas. And a lot of engineering work has been done to prevent this salty groundwater from entering our precious river Mara. Right, so groundwater is important, and we need to manage this resource properly. And very often we use a numerical groundwater model. And this is what a typical groundwater modeling project looks like. So first of all, we collect data either from the field or from desktop analysis, and then we form a conceptual understanding of the study area. And then we build a groundwater model which can calculate groundwater levels based on input parameters and boundary conditions. And then we do model calibration, which is quite a frustrating process if done manually. So it is a process of adjusting the model inputs so that the model outputs can match the historical observations. And after we calibrate the model is often then used as a crystal ball to answer all sorts of future prediction questions. And then lastly, we present findings to the decision makers, and then they decide what to do with the findings. So a groundwater model is useful when for groundwater management purpose, if used properly. However, groundwater model is not perfect. There are a number of limitations in groundwater models. There's a large uncertainty in the model results. And part of the reason is because we don't understand the subsurface well enough. For example, let's say this is our study area, and we've got 2 wells. The blue color indicates the aquifer that we are interested in. And the problem is, we don't know what is going on between the wells. Does it look linear like this? Or a bit more complex like this? Or perhaps this is likely to be wrong as well. Perhaps the reality looks something like this. So this is the problem. We don't understand the subsurface well enough. And this is where my PhD comes in. This slide summarizes what my PhD is about. So, yep, that's it. So my PhD is about, can we get groundwater model and geophysics to work together to achieve a better outcome? And I'm aware, so I'm going to talk about some limitations of geophysics in groundwater applications. And I'm aware that presenting this slide in front of a group of geophysicists is quite risky. So if I've said something not quite right, please be gentle with me. So firstly, geophysical interpretation can be ambiguous. For example, we can use EM to infer groundwater salinity. But let's say if we have got a high electrical conductivity signal, does that mean the presence of clay or saline groundwater? We don't know. And this is why very often people use borehole data to assist the interpretation. But again, borehole data are point scale, and we go back to the Mickey Mouse problem that we saw earlier. And also, depending on the area, you may or may not get enough borehole data. And secondly, the constraint that is used for geophysical inversion may be unrealistic. Very often, a smoothness constraint is used, which assumes things is smooth. This will definitely make the map look prettier, but whether this is realistic or not may depend on the area. And also, hydraulic conductivity is one of the most important parameters in groundwater modeling studies. And we can use a petrophysical relationship to link hydraulic conductivity with electrical resistivity. However, there is a large uncertainty in this relationship because this relationship is often empirically derived, highly site-specific, and also highly spatially variable. And the root of the problem is because most of these geophysical techniques cannot measure groundwater-related properties directly. They can only measure these properties. They can only infer these properties. And fortunately, there is a geophysical technique that is able to measure these properties directly, which is nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR. So for those of you who are not familiar with NMR, you may have heard about magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, which is widely used in the medical industry. Or you may have seen that in the movies. And NMR uses a very similar technique. It is just that instead of scanning a human body, it scans the subsurface. And there are 2 types of NMR. There's the borehole NMR, where you lower a probe down to the borehole, and that scans the subsurface surrounding the well. And there is also the surface NMR, which you place a loop on the surface, and then it can scan the subsurface. And for those of you who are not familiar with NMR, I'm going to challenge myself to explain this in 2 slides. So let's say we have got a study area, and there's a well. And for simplicity, let's just consider one water proton. So it's spinning. And the first step of NMR is to create a static magnetic field. And this will cause the water proton to now precess around this static field. And let's set up a signal versus time graph here as well. The second step is to create an oscillating magnetic field that is perpendicular to this static field. And this will cause the water proton to now precess around this new field. Next step, switch it off. And what will happen to the water proton? It will now revert back and then precess around the static field. And we can measure the signal decay, as you can see in the black graph. And then what we do next is we repeat this process. So turn it on, and then turn it off, and measure the signal decay. Turn it on, turn it off. On and off, on and off. Great. So now we have got a signal decay graph. So second slide, what can NMR tell us? First of all, by looking at the initial amplitude, it can tell us about the water content in the subsurface. And then we can also draw a line to describe the signal decay pattern. And from this line, we can tell about the porosity and the pore size distribution in the subsurface. And we can also use equations like the Schlumberger flow research equation to calculate relative permeability. Final slide. So now we have learned about NMR. My research question is, can we use a combination of EM and NMR to improve the groundwater salinity estimation? Can we do better than just using EM alone? And then I'll also explore different ways of incorporating this geophysical data into groundwater models. And I'll also see how geophysical data can improve the groundwater model performance by reducing the model uncertainty. And similarly, since NMR can calculate relative permeability, I will also look into whether we can use a combination of EM and NMR to develop a more robust relationship between hydraulic conductivity and electrical resistivity. From that, I'll see whether that can reduce the groundwater model uncertainty. So that's what I think currently my PhD will be about. But yeah, it may change over time. And this is it. So yeah, any feedback is welcome.
So do you have a particular site or a particular case that you really like to focus on so that you can kind of muster all your forces on that particular site?
Good question. Yes, yes. So yesterday we looked at the Bokpanon case study, and my study area will be in a similar floodplain environment in the River Murray area in South Australia. So the setting will be quite similar to the Bokpanon floodplain that we looked at yesterday. Well, there will be AEM data available and also quite a lot of borehole data. And yes, so that is a data-rich area.
For the example that you've got for the surface work, I mean, you need to know the background conductivity, right, in order to work with the NMR.
So when you say conductivity, do you mean the electrical conductivity or the hydraulic? Okay. Yes, good question. So yes, I would definitely need to look into that. But yeah, because I've just started my PhD about 4 months ago, so I'm still building up my geophysical knowledge. So this is something I will need to look into.
You actually do that with the NMR tool, you actually take
the NMR tool? Yeah, I will be using surface NMR.
Usually you just take a 10 and 10. Like you're going to be doing this with Tim and Adam, right?
With Aaron and Mark Hesh.
So they've got a smart 10, which is a ground system.
Oh, okay.
Excellent. Measurements before or at the same location to do the surface NMR study.
Cool. Okay, excellent.
Because the other thing that perhaps potentially plays a role, we've not looked at it within our group, but it's certainly something that's kind of on our radar, and that's to look at, effectively the IP response here and to convert the imaginary component of the complex conductivity into hydraulic conductivity.
Oh, this sounds exciting.
So, what's his name? Was that Colorado School of Mines? Matt? Pardon me? No, Andre Ravel.
Okay.
Has done a lot of work in that regard. So that might actually all kind of fit in nicely here, because you've got EM, there's a complex, perhaps there's a complex part of that electrical conductivity, which is related to hydraulic conductivity, and then you've got your NMR. Right. Just seems like there's a lot of things up there that, if you had it, especially if you have a nice study area, you could bring everything to bear.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'll look into IP as well. Thanks for the comment. Yep.
Anyways, does anybody here have, John, do you know of anybody in Australia who's been working at complex conductivity for hydraulic? Okay,
Cool. Thank you.
I think we'll do one more and then probably break.
Oh, we're gonna have our, we're saving the best till last, right? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You better get off of us than to say the best.
So flip this slide. This is laser pointing.
Okay. I don't want to be standing between you and lunch, so I'll keep it brief. So I'm Luke Peters. I'm working for CSIRO, and the last 7 years I've been doing mostly groundwater modeling and uncertainty analysis. I only started looking at geophysics very recently because I became part of the Deep Earth Imaging Future Science platform. Now that's kind of a very unique opportunity. From headquarters in CSIRO, we were giving a project for the next 3 years, basically blue sky thinking, our main aim is, can we do more with the existing data that we have on the subsurface, everything that we get from geophysics, to increase our chances of finding mineral deposits, hydrocarbons, and groundwater. Now that's very broad, and we're trying to figure out how that's going to pan out now. But what it will look like is me together with 5 colleagues will be supervising a team of about 18 postdocs who will be looking at a variety of things. And a lot of people will be coming with a geology, geophysics background, but also a lot of people with more statistics, software engineering, machine learning, geostatistics backgrounds. So we're trying to get a very diverse team together, hopefully to do some exciting science. Now, where I come in, it's really about, on one hand, the groundwater side. That's kind of where my expertise is. The other thing is the value of information. How do we can combine all the different data sets? How can we extract the most relevant information? How can we pinpoint that? So that's kind of the very big scheme. This is hopefully raising more questions than answers. What I'm looking for is case studies. And from a water resource perspective, one of the big questions that we always have, whether it's for irrigated agriculture, for mining, is where can we find a source of water that we can extract enough, quantity of water that we need with a good quality, low enough salinity, but the big downside is without compromising existing users. So existing bores, other people using the same source, or compromising how much water goes to the rivers or to springs. And so to answer that question, obviously you need to know your system incredibly well. And there's 2 projects where I'm looking for case studies. One is for PhD of Trina at AXA. The idea of Trina's PhD is we want to reduce the predictive uncertainty of groundwater models by combining groundwater modeling with geophysics. but also with environmental tracers. So environmental tracers, basically your geochemistry. Now, they're very different pieces of information about your system. So your geophysics, spatially very broad, but low information content. While an environmental tracer or chemistry, that's one sample at one location, but that's actually the integration. That geochemical signal is the result of the entire flow path from infiltration to where you sample. So it actually integrates an enormous amount of information over your system. So you've got very different sources of information, and I want to make sure that we can get the relevant bits out of it. And the other part that we're looking at is everything that we've seen so far is all deterministic. Like, you get your inversion and you get a picture. You get a groundwater model, you get a prediction. It's never like that. It's always a big range of things. And in the groundwater, where I want to go is, if I answer that question at the top, I don't want to give the answer, yes, you can pump 5 megaliters for the next 10 years. I want to say, well, you've got a probability of 60% if you drill here that you can sustain that. So I want to expand that and really be explicit and open about the uncertainties around. So that's kind of my spiel, what I'll be doing the next couple of years. Project in CSIRO, the Northern Australia Water Resources Assessment. And I was, well, sideways involved in that one, was in a conversation with hydrogeologists in Darwin, and they were looking at the Wildman area. So it's about 200 kilometers east of Darwin. So we're in the tropical part of Australia. Not a lot of people live here, and they basically did the basic water resource investigation. That they're kind of compiling this report, and just to give you an idea, sort of the quality of the maps. That this is a kind of typical scale of investigation. So this is about 10 kilometers, so maybe 30 by 50 kilometer area. Will we be looking at? Data density, it's pretty poor. So the green dots, that's just boreholes for mineral exploration. The red dots is the red and the orange ones are locations where we, they're all boreholes. I think only the red ones is where we can do monitoring of the groundwater system, where we can do sampling. Most of them are just locations where we have a borehole. As you can see, this is the entire road network. So it's a very sparsely populated area, but quite a lot of rivers coming through. And on this map, the green bits, that's where there are springs, or at least rainforest associated with springs. This bit here, there's a lagoon. It's got a permanent water feature. And I think around this area in the 80s, they tried to start a cashew farm that was not really successful. So that's kind of the background. So it's that kind of stuff. In this case, it would be, let's say, if you want to start farming here again, start irrigating. If you start pumping in, if you start pumping here, would you have a decent aquifer? And if you start pumping here, will you not compromise the flow in those rivers or any of the flow to the springs over here? That's kind of in very broad lines the questions we're looking at. And this is pretty much what the geology looks like. So what we've got is a Proterozoic basement covered by about, let's say, 50 meters of Mesozoic sands and clays. The Proterozoic basement, it's siltstone and sandstone, hardly any permeability, but then you've got these dollostones and limestones there, locally karstified, tops sometimes quite weathered. So if you're looking for groundwater in this setting, what you would be targeting is sandy parts of that cover. So that covers either sand or clay, or a very weird mixture between the two. Or the weathered top of the basement, especially in the dollar stones where you would have a bit more intense weathering and higher permeability. This is kind of a lithological log that's representative. So weathered rock. The hardest bit for us to get a handle on is that saprolite. So that top of the weathered zone, very clay rich. So that can actually determine whether you have just small pocket of water cover that's completely confined, not in connection with the rest of the system. Or if it's not present, you can have a continuous weathered rock covered with a sand, so a continuous aquifer. So it is really about trying to figure out where do you have these weathered zones, where do you have these sand pockets, and even more important, how are they connected? Like this ridge, is that really there, or is that thicker? Is this sand lens, is that continuous with this part, or is this just covered with a clay, and is this another lens? So it's really at that local scale, where are your sand pockets, where are your clays, how does that saprolite fit in? So there is some data, we've got some boreholes, and I started looking last week at the website of GeoSci.xyz Australia. Sorry.
If on that plot, so what would the conductivities of those units be?
I would have no idea.
Is this a gamma plot? Or
yeah, so that's a gamma plot. Sorry. Try to squint.
It's
So the satellite, that's.
yeah, normally it's good. It's normally clay. It's as you can see, that's why they kick in the gammas.
But it's a transition zone, so
that's one of the other things. It's where do you go from Mesozoic clay to saprolite? Because sometimes that, well, even in boreholes, like in drill logs, you would struggle to pinpoint where that transition is. And one of the reasons I'm interested in this is a pretty generic setting. Like throughout the north, you would find this kind of deposits. And if you're lucky enough that there is a mineral deposit somewhere here, your mining company would be looking for water or sediments. So that's the other bit. It's like you would not be targeting that for a water resource. It's more if you find mineral deposits, you would be looking here in the, let's say, 50 kilometers around your deposit, where can I find water? So otherwise it won't be economical anymore. So just to give you another feel of the local hydrogeologist is a great guy. He's got 20, 30 years experience in that area. And this is the water table map he came up with. So it's hand-drawn. And around here, yeah, that's pretty good because he's got data. But, well, I was talking about this map with him and he's like, yeah, this is a lot of interpretation. I have no idea what's going on there. Same here, we actually don't even know whether these readings of water level that we have, whether they're in the same aquifer or not. Although that map exists, it's more raising the questions of all the things that we don't know about the system rather than answering them. So obviously then the big, like, to me it's the very exciting thing, oh, let's see to geophysics, what can geophysics tell us? And that's my question for the moment, like, what kind of techniques in geophysics can we use? And there's not a lot of money in groundwater, so I'm looking for cheap things.
So it's a whole big airborne answer from the
So that's what I say. Like I was on the website of GeoSci Australia. A bit of digging around thanks the jungle. So think well, and that's pretty much where I'm stuck now. Is so this is this is kind of the study area. So flight lines here are about 1.6 kilometers apart, and then here's a section where they're 5 kilometers apart. The reason there's no flight lines here or there, that's Kakadu National Park. So there's not much that we're allowed to do there, and that's the Mary River National Park, I think. same deal, so we can't, there's no access there. This is one of the conductivity cross sections for one of the line here. And this is a depth slice of the conductivity in students per meter. Now, so that goes down to about 400 meters, but we're only interested in that top 100 meter. And it's overall very low conductivity. Like, my question is AEM a good tool here? Should I be trying to get more out of this data, or is this?
Run a stochastic one.
Well, no, but that's my question. Like, how far, as a hydrogeologist with well, all my experience in geophysics is what I learned yesterday.
You're in real trouble.
Yes. How far do I go in making interpretations of that? Like, do I look at the raw data again? Do I try an inversion? Do I try other on-ground techniques? Well, I'm just trying to get some feedback or some ideas here of, well, hopefully avoiding me and Trina making very stupid mistakes and chasing ideas that are not useful.
Yes, too long.
I will be making mistakes, is that what you're saying?
That's a 1D section up there for starting.
Ah, yes.
You run 3D model, is it the UVC code, or is it
Long line discuss. It's this kilometers.
two broad spaces?
I mean, why would the 3D necessarily, what you're trying to make is the water table, right?
It is a here.
Not just water table, like even if I can get to the a good handle of the depth to basements, that would be already constraining a lot of the issues in that system. So the water table, I'm not too fussed about the water table in this case because it's the dry and wet season dynamic that you have as well. So it fills up during the wet and then slowly dries out. So it really depends when you do your survey and what kind of wet season that you have. At least one less complicated factor here, it's all fresh. Like all the water is fresh, there's no saline water. So that, at least that's not complicating things here.
Look at, there's a lot of stuff that has been done on that data set, but I would suggest, yes, reinvert, as you say, you've just got one node, that's a 1D, maybe try 2-layer fixing the depth basement, you know that as a more system, and start plugging a few of your holes and things that data set has not been expected. You saw that's a 30-layer smooth model, there's so many other things you can do.
Yeah.
Get Jörg and those guys to do stochastic on it.
Oh, that's one of the plans.
Yes.
It's for the moment. I don't want to get too excited just because I know my colleagues have been doing the geochemistry on the area, so we've got a lot of that side of the thing. I just don't want to get too excited and then.
So you mentioned doing a stochastic. What exactly are you referring to, and why would you do it? What's that?
Well, some of the things we found is that if you run several forward modules on one sounding, for instance, so that we start building distribution function that gives us, explores the wider space as opposed to getting fixated on one possible model. And it seems to be very effective for depth basements, for instance, in areas where you have a 30-layer smooth, so you're already discretizing your 30 layers, so your depth is, I mean, we're getting out to inversion, I guess, but we found that in some parts running sort of an ample stochastic gives us a better sort of handle on all a series of possibilities
models in that area.
I guess, I don't know, that's something I personally kind of interested in. I mean, there's so much flexibility that exists within, just a generic inversion, and it's true that each inversion picks out one result, but you have so much flexibility in the a priori information within, and also in log objective functions and changing, the various norms and metrics that our experience at least has been that, rather than just sort of randomly choosing or having out choose a zillion parameters and then hoping that you've done proper sampling, that you've got a good distribution, you've got possible results, that you look at a result and you try to ask specific questions about that tailor objective function, and then run again and then see what you get. And so it's a bit more of a focus, right? That might be interesting. I think Jason might be kind of interesting to compare, especially if you've got a geologic scenario where you kind of think this is what's happening, and then you approach that with a stochastic version, see what you get out. But we could also try to see, okay, what is the a priori information bounds or different kinds of penalties or regularization functions that you put in that could give you something, and then use that as a base of. And with Lindsay, will talk more about the 1D version codes that that we have, and they're now available, which is published in a tutorial. And I think the SIDPEG environment and trying to have an open source communication, this would be great. If you get a couple of soundings in an area that's just really interesting, then go ahead and do that. We've actually asked for some of the soundings for the boot pronoun to be available. And so, we were given the okay to do that, so we plan to have that on the website. But the example you're talking about, and you're better off, we should try this stochastic on that. I mean, it'd be great. I don't know that. So I think if we could kind of do one step more than just talk about it, but actually find an example, concentrate on it, pick something up there.
Because it fits into a bigger issue that's very live in the groundwater community at the moment, is the conceptual model uncertainty. We usually just go with one conceptualization of our aquifer system. That's what we model, and it's just too hard to change. So anything that we can do to explore different conceptualizations, like if we've got two sand lenses, are they connected or not? Usually you just go for where the strongest evidence is, and you exclude everything else. So anything where we can options of whether they are consistent with geophysics, like if you can do an inversion that shows now there is actually a big reach between the two, if you can get that from the AEM data, that would be brilliant for us, because that's excluding a heap of conceptualizations that we don't have to worry about in the future. So that's the kind of thinking I'm trying to get into. So.
And I think the example that show you have magnetic zero gravity, and you have the, it's going to space, but just thinking on that side, so that's the way
No, that's for me. I'm just not familiar enough with everything and whether it has resolution in that top 50 meters. But yeah, no, quite happy to have a bit more conversation around it.
The other thing to look for is that there might actually be high resolution company data sets in those areas.
Yeah, I think I've been looking at it. There's I think one DC resistivity survey from the 80s here. But the other airborne ones are just to the north and south. Like we just missed our favorite spot. But that's pretty much what I have to say.
What do we have left? Because we have only one talk left, I suggest we do it. If we've got more than one, let's break for,
There were.
Yeah, well,
We've got two over here, so we're happy to do them after lunch.
Okay.
Yeah, we might as well.
oh, let's do all three then after.
Four.
And you've got one as well?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Oh,
4.5.
perfect. Okay, so let's,
Drop mine.
So is 1 hour?
oh, let's try that.
Okay.
We just need to grab something.
Any recommendations of places around here?
There's the city campus there.
Yeah, that'd be great.
There's more slides.
What's this? Yeah. We are, yes. That was, I would not recommend it. It was we had, high school scouts and, you know, because we're just looking at these
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes.
Let's see, like very high. And I think it's like the next day.
Yes.
And did you need to check to see if all these cast members?
Yeah, so there's places to like
That one's very, you just need it, first experiments and
Is there somebody that's going to be staying in the room? You guys?
This is sort of standalone.
Would you guys mind to hang out here or?
Yeah. Yes, please.
I'm sorry.
What's the I'm sticking to my computer, so that's telling me there's something wrong with this stick.
Bring stuff back.
So which one should I be
Wait,
ready?
which is?
It's under this.
Half an hour.
And you would be able to pop that presentation that Doug gave this morning about the MIP on.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You
That's a
know what I
great
can
talk
do?
this morning.
I'll post them on with all of the Adelaide presentations. Yeah, because it would be good to have them up there.
I've got one little animation. So if I just want to see
Good animation.
It's
Showing everybody up.
No, it's just from I just read some slides from.
That's great. Yeah, sure, if you
Thanks. Did that open okay?
let's give it a try. Which is that this one?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that looks good.
Good. Looks like it's working.
And I'm going to try.
Just
Great talk this morning, Doug.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad you like that. I think that's, yeah, that showcases some of the things that we can do.
yeah. I don't know, it's like some guys in my team, it's 2 days.
I only went through it, just sort of explained that. That's really cool. It's there.
Oh, okay.
So they end up having
Cool.
visitors.
Yeah,
I think that's really
uh,
Yeah, I've got a section
with your UBC code there, so.
And do you mind if I keep a copy of this and post it?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, that material still exists.
Yeah, so
So
I'll
it's
just
a big
toss Lindsay about, she said.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah, grab yourself some lunch.
first two
Yeah, I
are
think
the
that's
same,
awesome.
just the PDF
Okay,
version of
okay.
that. And those two PDFs, I might just kind of show bits of those as
Sure.
well.
and I'm happy for it to all.
Hello, Ross, how are you?
And I'll explain it all. So it's all available online, so I'm
Oh,
happy
great.
to go out through your channels as well.
That would be great. Yeah, what I might actually do, and we can do this, I guess, once everybody gets back, is maybe just do, because here there's enough that we're gonna lose track of the names. It's just gonna be like a PC PowerPoint with their name.
Not too good. Oh, yeah, okay.
Or if it's on the first slide, that's fine as well.
Mine probably isn't, so I'll
Okay.
get that with you later on. Sort it
Okay,
out.
let's go,
That sounds good.
we'll just pick up something and bring it back.
Is somebody